Long before anyone in Rome or Constantinople had heard the name Hun, these horsemen were already part of a web stretching from China to the Black Sea. Archaeologists today find fragments of their world bronze cauldrons buried beside horse bones, arrowheads shaped for piercing armor, skulls elongated into alien shapes. Their traces whisper of trade that reached Persia and India, and of rituals as old as the steppe winds. Their origins, though, that's where the mist thickens. Some say they descended from the Xiongnu, those fierce nomads who once battled the emperors of China. The Chinese called the Xiongnu devils of the North barbarians, who swept down like a storm and vanished before the morning fog burned away. When the Han armies finally broke their power around the 1st century CE, the remnants scattered westward. Some vanished into legend. Others perhaps kept riding. Imagine one of those exiled clans pausing somewhere near the Altai, rebuilding its herds, children growing up listening to the elders' stories of great battles fought under red banners. Now imagine their descendants, centuries later, still on horseback, still following the herds, but with new words, new gods, new scars. The continuity isn't proven, but the pattern feels inevitable. Cultures on the steppe pass like wind currents, one wave of riders rising where another fell. The Huns carried that inheritance, the discipline of the bow, the art of fast war, the belief that motion itself was safety. The bow was not merely a weapon, it was an extension of their being a tool, perfected over generations. Layers of horn sinew and wood bent into a short curved shape that could strike from the saddle at a gallop. The Huns' children learned to string it before they could speak in full sentences. Their horses, small but tireless, could run for hours without rest, fed on grass that would kill a Roman stallion. From these elements, hunger, horse, and habit emerged a culture no wall could contain. They didn't build monuments, they left them smoking behind. Their homes were circular tents of felt and hide, warm in winter, cool in summer, easy to take apart and load onto wagons. To the settled peoples of the world, this rootless life seemed barbaric. But to the Huns, staying in one place was madness. The horizon was home. Archaeological sites like Noin Ula in Mongolia and Tilia Tepe in Afghanistan reveal a steppe civilization far from primitive bronze vessels with intricate handles, mirrors from China, glass beads from Rome. Every object tells a story of motion goods, traded hand-to-hand culture, spreading faster than empire. The Huns would inherit this mobility and make it terrifyingly efficient. But before they became conquerors, they were wanderers. Picture them around the fire at night, the grass whispering beyond the ring of light, stars brighter than any city's lamps. Somewhere, a shaman beats a drum. Somewhere, a horse snorts restless. The elders speak of spirits who ride the wind and guide the hunt of ancestors who live in the constellations. The children listen wide-eyed, their skulls already bound with leather bands to shape the long, sloping heads that will mark them as warriors. No one knows the name of the first Hun leader. There is no founding hero, no Romulus or Moses of the steppe. Their unity was forged not by myth, but by necessity, by the logic of survival. When grass grew scarce, tribes fought. When winters lengthened, they moved. When strangers crossed their grazing lands, the Huns struck first. Violence was not cruelty, it was geography made into law. Over generations, this law produced a people so skilled in movement that even their enemies could scarcely comprehend them. They could appear at dawn and vanish by noon, leaving behind only smoke and hoof prints. To the settled world, they seemed supernatural demons, perhaps, or spirits of war. The truth was simpler and more frightening. They were human beings who had adapted perfectly to a world without walls. By the time the first Roman scribes heard whispers of them, the Huns were already moving westward, drawn by the same forces that had driven countless migrations before them, drought-cold ambition. Somewhere east of the Caspian, a young chieftain looked toward the setting sun and saw opportunity pastures, unclaimed rivers, unbridged empires unaware. From that glance began a storm that would roll across half the world. And like every storm, it began quietly, with the wind rising over the grass and the faint rhythmic thunder of distant hooves. If you could walk through a Hun encampment at dawn, you'd smell smoke and horsehide before you saw the people. The camp would already be stirring women, folding sleeping mats, men, brushing down horses, the soft thud of hooves against the earth as herds drift toward the morning light. It would look almost peaceful. But the moment the tents came down, the Huns were on the move. Again, their entire world loaded onto wagons, creaking toward the horizon. Nothing about them was static. Even their culture, what they believed, how they dressed, what they buried, was designed for motion. Their tools were light, their art portable, their gods mobile enough to keep up. One of the few things they left behind in quantity were bronze cauldrons, large, shallow, wide-bellied things with curved handles shaped like mushrooms. Archaeologists find them buried near rivers or in the remnants of campsites stretching from Mongolia to Hungary, as if the Huns had dropped breadcrumbs of metal across the continent. These cauldrons weren't just for cooking stew, though no doubt they did that too. They were ceremonial. When the Huns held feasts or made sacrifices to their ancestors or sky spirits, these were the vessels that steamed in the firelight. The sound of boiling water was to them a sound of community and blessing. To a Hun, life was an unbroken circuit of riding, hunting, feasting, and remembering. Their religion, if we can call it that, was an earthy mixture of shamanism and ancestor veneration. They saw the world as layered the sky above, ruled by the eternal blue god Tengri. The earth below, populated by restless spirits. The middle realm, their realm, one of constant negotiation between both. When the wind shifted strangely, or a horse stumbled without cause that was no accident, it was a sign. Someone had displeased the spirits or ignored a ritual. At the heart of these beliefs stood the horse, both sacred companion and cosmic partner. Horses were everything transportation, currency, food, and symbol. A Hun boy could ride before he could walk. His first horse was a brother. His last, perhaps, would be slaughtered at his funeral to join him in the next world. Archaeologists find horse bones buried beside human graves, sometimes whole skeletons, sometimes just the head, always positioned carefully facing the same direction as the riders. The horse, they believed, would carry the soul into eternity. If you examined one of those skeletons, you'd notice something else. The horses were small, barely higher than a modern pony, but immensely strong. They could gallop for hours without food, survive on scrubby grass, and endure cold that would kill larger breeds. The Huns and their horses were in a way the same creature, a fusion of endurance and precision. And then there were the people themselves. Contemporary Roman writers couldn't stop describing them, though they didn't do it kindly. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century, called them so prodigiously ugly that they might be mistaken for beasts. It wasn't prejudice alone, it was confusion. The Huns practiced cranial deformation, binding the heads of infants between boards, or with tight bandages so that the skull elongated as it grew. The result was a high sloping forehead that gave the face an inhuman profile. Combine that with weathered skin scars deliberately cut into the cheeks during adolescence and dark narrow eyes, and you had a visage unlike anything Romans had ever seen. To the Huns, though, this was beauty and identity. The long head symbolized noble birth. The scars marked bravery and belonging. It said, "I am of the steppe. I am of the wind." Their clothing followed the same logic: practical, layered, and ready for movement. They wore tunics and trousers of thick felt or leather, stitched with fur, and trimmed with small bits of bronze or gold for decoration. Their boots, soft-soled for riding, could wrap higher than the knee. Every item was designed to be repaired on the go. Wealthy warriors sometimes adorned their coats with silk from China, or jewelry taken from Roman merchants, spoils of the Silk Road stitched right into their sleeves. Despite the stereotypes, the Huns were not the ragged savages that terrified medieval chroniclers. They were traders and artisans, their wagons carrying not just weapons, but goods from across continents. In one burial mound, archaeologists found a glass cup from Rome Chinese silk embroidered with birds, and a handful of cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, all in the grave of a single warrior. That's not chaos. That's globalization, 5th century style. Even their pottery tells a story of balance between necessity and art. Hewn ceramics are coarse but purposeful large storage jars for milk and grain, smaller pots for cooking no frills. They valued utility over luxury. A pot's worth was measured in how many times it could survive the fire, not how pretty it looked. Yet among those rough surfaces, you'll sometimes find small marks, simple symbols scratched in before firing, maybe initials, maybe prayers. Tiny gestures of individuality from people who knew how easily life and clay could shatter. If you could visit a Hun burial, just once you'd understand them better than any Roman ever did. Picture it, a rectangular grave, aligned east to west, the body lying curled on its side like someone asleep. Around it, weapons, pottery, bits of horse gear, and sometimes bronze mirrors placed carefully near the head. In the next pit, a horse's skeleton. The grave might be shallow, the goods modest, but everything has meaning. The mirrors, for the soul to recognize itself in the afterlife. The horse, for the journey. The bronze vessel, a gift to the ancestors. Even in death, they were travelers. Their society, though it left no written records, was structured by invisible rules every bit as strict as Rome's. Each clan had its leaders, its warriors, its shamans, its herdsmen. Loyalty was personal, not bureaucratic. You followed the man whose horse rode fastest, whose arrows flew straightest, whose generosity fed your family through winter. Power came not from law, but from reputation. And once lost, it was nearly impossible to regain. To outsiders, that world looked chaotic. To the Huns, it was perfectly ordered. They were bound by honor, survival, and the certainty that the steppe itself chose who thrived. You could not own the land because the land owned you. You could not cling to possessions because the wind would take them. All you could do was ride well, fight bravely, and leave behind a name whispered by the next campfire. In the centuries to come, that name Hun would echo through Europe like a thunderclap. But here, at their dawn, before Rome trembled and kingdoms burned, they were simply people of the grass and sky. Their empire was still unborn, but their rhythm, the heartbeat of hooves and wind, had already begun. If the Huns had a single language, it wasn't one you could write down. It was the language of war. Not the noisy kind of war, with battle horns and speeches, but a quiet, deliberate artistry of motion. Every movement, every flick of the wrist on a bowstring, every shift of the reins spoke volumes. For the Huns, war wasn't a special occasion. It was simply another form of survival. They didn't invent mounted warfare, but they perfected it. To watch a Hun army move was to see precision born of instinct. Imagine 10,000 riders fanning out across the horizon, like a flock of birds, each man guiding his horse, with knees alone, bow already drawn. To their enemies, Romans, Goths, Alans, it must have looked supernatural, this silent gliding tide of men who could shoot, wheel, and vanish in a heartbeat. The heart of that power was the composite bow, one of the most sophisticated weapons the ancient world ever knew. Not a long, elegant wooden arc like the English bows of legend, but a compact, deadly curve of layered horn sinew and wood engineered with the precision of a modern machine. Its size made it perfect for use on horseback. Its strength, great enough to drive an arrow through armor at over 200 yards. Constructing one took months. Horn from mountain rams, for compression sinew from deer or oxen, for tension, and wood from birch or maple as the spine. Every layer glued and wrapped cured for weeks under tension until it could bend and snap with terrifying speed. The result was an object of both beauty and terror, small enough to hold in one hand, strong enough to change history. Roman soldiers used to fighting Germanic infantry or lumbering cavalry were bewildered by these weapons. Against a wall of shields, the Huns did not charge, they circled, fired, and withdrew, again and again, until discipline broke. When their enemies advanced, the Huns retreated, loosing arrows, as they went the famous feigned retreat that lured even veteran commanders into disaster. Chase them too far, and you'd find your army suddenly surrounded, arrows raining in from every direction. The Huns' warfare was a performance, half strategy, half theater. They wanted not just victory, but fear, and they cultivated it like an art form. A Roman officer might expect an army to march camp and meet him on open ground. The Huns preferred to make him wait in silence, sleep poorly, and see his scouts vanish without a trace. When the attack came, it was never frontal. It was everywhere. Then there was their appearance, a weapon in itself. The long sloping skulls, the scars carved into their cheeks, the furs stitched with enemy bones, it wasn't accidental. A Hun warrior's body was a battlefield of symbols. Roman writers, unnerved, described them as inhuman spawn of demons. The Huns, of course, encouraged that impression. If fear won battles before the first arrow flew, why argue even their horses were instruments of war? Small, sturdy, fast, and utterly obedient, they could pivot on a coin and sprint for hours. The bond between horse and rider bordered on the mystical. A Hun warrior could guide his mount with nothing but the pressure of his knees freeing his hands to shoot. He could sleep in the saddle, eat in the saddle, even according to horrified chroniclers, perform surgical repairs on wounds without dismounting. Whether that's true or not, it tells you how complete the image of the mounted Hun was in the minds of his enemies, half man, half beast, entirely unstoppable. They rode with specialized gear that revolutionized mounted combat. Their saddles had high pommels and cantles to anchor the rider securely during violent motion, allowing him to twist and shoot behind him without falling. And their stirrups, yes, those humble iron loops were a revolution in themselves. With stirrups, a rider could stand aim and release with full power, or deliver a lance strike with both hands steady. The stirrup may seem simple, but it transformed the rider from passenger to predator. In their hands, warfare became mobile, flexible, unpredictable. Unlike the Romans who built supply lines, the Huns were their supply line. Herds of horses' wagons of dried meat and milk cured entire families followed the army. They didn't retreat to safety after battle. Safety traveled with them. Every warrior was his own logistics officer, blacksmith, and hunter. And yet, for all their efficiency, the Huns weren't mindless raiders. There was calculation in every campaign. They attacked not to conquer territory. They had no use for cities, but to control trade routes, demand tribute, and break alliances. They understood, perhaps better than any empire of their age, that fear was currency. Once their reputation preceded them, many enemies surrendered before the first arrow was drawn. But there was a deeper elegance to their warfare, something almost spiritual. They believed that victory flowed from balance between rider and horseman, and spirit, land and sky. A warrior who rode out of harmony, who disrespected omens, or boasted too loudly, invited disaster. Before battle, shamans performed rituals, burning herbs, chanting to the wind, sprinkling milk or blood on the earth. The gods of the steppe demanded respect, and in return, they gave speed and precision. In that world, courage wasn't about charging blindly, it was about calm. The calm of a man who could loose 3 arrows in 5 seconds while galloping full tilt through chaos, every shot deliberate. The calm of a commander who could vanish into the mist and reappear at your flank before you'd even reformed your line. Their enemies wrote of them in tones that wavered between terror and awe. The Gothic historian Jordanes described how their coming was like a thunderbolt, and Ammianus Marcellinus confessed that the Romans had no word to describe them. That, perhaps, is the essence of the Huns. They existed just beyond the vocabulary of civilization. By the middle of the 4th century, this strange, disciplined storm of riders began to drift west, driven by drought, hunger, and opportunity. Across the Volga River, they came crossing from Asia into Europe, a threshold that had long separated worlds. To the tribes on the far side, the Alans and Goths, and countless others, it must have seemed as if the edge of the earth had come alive. They didn't know it yet, but the steppe had just opened a new chapter in history. The wind that carried the Huns westward would shake empires, scatter nations, and rewrite the map of Europe. And in the distance, through the rising dust, one could already hear the whisper of hooves and the faint twang of bowstrings in the dawn. If the Huns had gods, they were probably fickle ones, because the sky itself turned against them. Around the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the vast heart of Central Asia began to change. The winters grew longer, the grass shorter, and the wind sharper. For nomads, that was disaster. The steppe is generous only when it wants to be, and when it stops feeding your horses, it stops feeding you. Tree ring data and ice cores tell the story now, but the Huns didn't need scientists to know something was wrong. Rivers froze earlier. Snow lingered into spring. Herds that once fattened on endless grass began to weaken. Pastures died one by one, until the landscape itself became an enemy. For centuries, nomadic life on the steppe had been a delicate balance when one group's pasture failed. It moved, displacing the next, which displaced another, and so on, like dominoes falling across the horizon. When the weather turned, that chain reaction became unstoppable. And somewhere in that slow avalanche of migrations, the Huns began to move west. We don't know who gave the first order. Maybe it wasn't an order at all, just a series of small, desperate decisions. A clan followed the herds a little farther west one season. A rival tribe attacked. A shaman declared that the spirits of the east had grown cold. Gradually, step by step, camp by camp, they followed the sunset, carrying with them everything they owned: families, tents, herds, and the ghosts of their ancestors. By the 3rd century, these wanderers reached the lands around the Aral Sea, where the grass was still good and the trade routes glittered with opportunity. But they weren't alone. The steppe was crowded with displaced peoples: Sarmatians, Alans, and countless others, each one pushing the next. The Huns, as always, adapted. When they couldn't find space, they took it. Archaeologists can trace this slow westward creep, like the footprints of a storm. In layers of soil across modern Kazakhstan and southern Russia, you can find the markers of change: new burial mounds, foreign-style pottery, and most distinctively, skulls showing artificial cranial deformation. The long sloping heads that had been a Hun hallmark appear suddenly, startlingly, in regions that had never seen them before. It's as if an entire culture had picked itself up and walked across the map. These were not random wanderers. They followed rivers and trade paths, the ancient arteries of the Silk Road linking east to west. Their camps popped up near oases and river crossings ideal for both grazing and ambushing. And wherever they paused, they left traces of their distinctive world: bronze cauldrons buried near springs, horse bones laid in ritual positions, and arrowheads that whisper of skirmishes fought and forgotten. But behind their movement lay something deeper than survival. There was a cultural momentum, a habit of the steppe itself. The Huns, like the winds they rode with, were not meant to stay still. They carried their universe with them: faith, fear, families, and wherever the horizon seemed open, they went. The climate shift was only one reason for their migration. Politics was another. To the east, Chinese campaigns had shattered the once powerful Xiongnu Confederation, scattering fragments of nomadic tribes westward. Each fragment carried pieces of language leadership structures and technology that would eventually merge into the entity we call the Huns. They inherited a political grammar of the steppe, a system of clans bound by loyalty, a hierarchy of warlords, and a decimal military structure units of 10, 100, 1,000. Efficient, simple, unstoppable. And so, by the 3rd and early 4th centuries, a new confederation was forming, though no one yet knew its name. Its leaders learned to bind smaller tribes not through treaties, but through fear and reward. Submit, and you share in plunder. Resist, and your camp burns. That formula worked everywhere from the Gobi to the Volga. It was at the Volga River, around the year 350 CE, that the Huns crossed an invisible boundary. The Volga wasn't just a river, it was the symbolic frontier between Asia and Europe. To cross it was to enter another world, one that had never seen anything like them. The lands beyond were dotted with farming villages, fortified towns, and semi-nomadic peoples who traded with Rome. They had rules, borders, neighbors, things the Huns found wonderfully irrelevant. When the first Hun scouts forded the Volga, they probably didn't realize they were stepping into history. They were just following the herds looking for better grass. But what followed them, their families, their rivals, their ambitions, would reshape a continent. The shock waves spread fast. To the west lived the Alans' proud horsemen who'd ruled these plains for centuries. They traded with both Rome and Persia, herding their cattle along the Don River and boasting of their fine armor and long lances. They were in many ways steppe aristocrats, warriors on horseback, yes, but disciplined, noble, almost civilized in the Roman sense. And then one morning, their scouts rode back with strange reports of riders who came out of the east like ghosts, small men on small horses who shot arrows faster than the eye could follow. At first, the Alans laughed. Then they stopped laughing. The Huns had arrived. They didn't announce themselves with treaties or envoys. They appeared struck and vanished. Villages that had stood for generations went up in smoke. Traders disappeared. Refugees fled westward, babbling about faces scarred like beasts' riders who could shoot backwards at full gallop arrows that fell like rain. It wasn't a war, yet it was a rumor. But the rumor was enough. Across the steppes and forests, people began to move, gathering their herds, loading their wagons, whispering the name Huni like a curse. The dominoes had begun to fall, one after another, and by the time the dust settled, those ripples would reach all the way to the gates of Rome. The first true test of the Huns' power came not against empires or legions, but against a people much like themselves, the Alans. The Alans were no easy prey. They had ruled the steppe lands between the Don and the Caspian for generations, descendants of the proud Sarmatian tribes that had once terrified Persia and traded horses to Rome. They were horsemen, too tall, broad-shouldered, their armor gleaming with scale plates, their long lances made for the thunder of a direct charge. They lived in a world that balanced brutality with elegance. Their warriors feasted from silver cups, their chieftains wore belts adorned with golden plaques. Their horses were decorated almost as richly as their riders. But they were used to a kind of warfare that, while fierce, followed certain patterns, cavalry lines meeting with a crash arrows exchanged before the melee victory or defeat sealed in a single glorious charge. The Huns didn't play by those rules. No one recorded the first clash between Hun and Alan, but we can imagine it from what came later, because every enemy they met told the same story. It begins at dawn, mist curls along the grasslands, and the Alans, confident in their armor and numbers, form their battle line. They see nothing, just the empty horizon, trembling slightly with heat. Then faintly, they hear it, the low murmur of hooves. The sound swells, becomes thunder. The horizon darkens with movement, and then the Huns appear. Thousands of riders, fast and fluid as water, sweep across the field in loose formation. No trumpets, no banners, just motion, constant, disorienting, hypnotic. The Alans brace for the charge, but it never comes. Instead, the sky begins to rain iron. Arrows hiss through the air in continuous waves, each shot precise, deadly. The Alans raise their shields, but the volleys keep coming from the flanks, from behind, from nowhere. The Huns move like smoke, vanishing and reappearing, circling their prey. The Alans charge forward in frustration, trying to close the distance, but the Huns pull away, firing as they retreat. Their horses pivot effortlessly, turning the battlefield into a whirlpool of confusion. When the Alans regroup, they find themselves surrounded. For all their courage, they cannot match this kind of fight. Their long lances are useless against enemies who never come close. Their heavy armor, once a source of pride, becomes a burden. Men collapse under exhaustion, horses stumble, and the air fills with the screams of animals and the eerie whistling hum of bowstrings. When the Huns finally charge, it is not the glorious cavalry charge of tradition. It's a sudden, merciless wave of precision, short spears, flashing sabers, cutting hooves, trampling. The battle that began as a contest ends as a massacre. The Alans break. Some flee, west others are captured. Those who survive face a choice: resist and die, or join the new masters of the steppe. Many choose the latter. It's here that we see one of the Huns' greatest strengths, not just their skill in war, but their talent for absorption. Conquest wasn't just destruction, it was recruitment. The Huns didn't want to exterminate strong enemies, they wanted to use them. The Alans, with their ironwork, their horses, and their knowledge of Western trade, were too valuable to waste, and so slowly, the two peoples merged. Archaeological evidence tells the story. Graves once purely Alan begin to show Hun-style artifacts: bronze cauldrons, steppe mirrors, composite bows. The children buried in those graves have elongated skulls, a practice previously unknown among the Alans. Within a generation, the two peoples were indistinguishable. The Huns had absorbed their first empire without ever building one. Roman chroniclers later described this process with dread fascination. They saw it as contamination, a spreading plague of barbarism. But to the Huns, it was evolution. Each tribe they conquered became another sinew in the body of the Confederation. From the newly conquered Alans, the Huns learned new blacksmithing techniques, refining their arrowheads and bridles. They gained access to Western trade routes and new breeds of horses. And they gained, most importantly, the aura of invincibility. Word of their victory spread faster than they could ride. To the Goths, further west, the message was clear: a new storm was coming, and it had already devoured the masters of the East. Those who heard the stories described monsters. The Alans who escaped said the Huns had the faces of demons and the patience of wolves. They could chase a man for days without stopping. They drank the blood of their horses to survive thirst. They appeared out of the horizon like spirits, and when they left, nothing remained but ash. Exaggerations, perhaps, but not by much. In truth, the Huns were more terrifying precisely because they were not supernatural. They were human beings who had made efficiency into an art form. They didn't fight for plunder alone. They fought to dominate, to command fear so profound that resistance felt useless. And they succeeded. By the time the Alans' scattered survivors reached the lands of the Goths, they brought not just tales, but terror itself. They described an enemy that could not be bargained with, that moved faster than news that left no prisoners worth ransoming. They described the horizon itself turning black with riders. The Goths listened, and then one by one they began to move too, packing up their wagons, gathering their families, and heading west toward the borders of Rome. The great migration that would shatter the ancient world had begun, and at its heart, unseen but unstoppable, rode the Huns, small in number, immense in consequence, their arrows now aimed at the entire map of Europe. When the Alans fled west, they carried more than wounds and ashes. They carried a whisper that moved faster than any horse could run, a whisper that said the world was ending. Among the Gothic tribes living beyond the Dniester and Dnieper rivers, those whispers turned into panic. The Goths split broadly into two confederations. The Tervings in the west and the Greuthungs in the east had built thriving kingdoms on the fertile lands of what is now Ukraine and Romania. They farmed, traded with Rome, and had even begun to adopt the Christian faith. To them, the steppe to the east had always been dangerous, but manageable. A place for herders and raiders, yes, but not a place from which civilization itself could be uprooted. And then came the refugees. The first groups of Alans arrived ragged and half-starved. Their armor dented their horses bleeding from long rides. They told stories that sounded like fever dreams of short-scarred men with faces stretched by strange rituals who fought like phantoms and rode without rest. The Gothic chieftains laughed at first. They had fought the Sarmatians, the Vandals, even Roman legions. What new terror could the steppe possibly produce? They didn't have to wait long to find out. One morning, scouts returned with wild eyes. They spoke of villages burned of herds, vanished of riders whose arrows came before their shadows. The Huns were no rumor anymore. They were a horizon of fire. To understand the Gothic world at that moment is to picture a dam cracking. Behind it was a civilization, fragile but proud, built on trade and alliance. In front of it lay the open wilderness of Europe, dotted with Roman garrisons and the fading echoes of empire. When the Huns hit that dam, it didn't just break, it exploded. The Eastern Goths, the Greuthungs, were the first to feel it. Their great king Ermanaric, a ruler whose influence stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, had built what was effectively a Gothic empire. Roman historians admired him. He was powerful, organized a barbarian Augustus. But his realm was not built for a war of ghosts and arrows. When the Huns swept in around 375 CE, Ermanaric faced something he had never encountered before, an enemy who refused to stand still. His cavalry couldn't pin them down, his fortresses couldn't find them, and his alliances shattered as neighboring tribes either fled or switched sides. Chroniclers later claimed the old king, seeing his world crumble, took his own life in despair. Whether true or not, his death marked the end of Gothic power in the east. The Greuthungs fled westward, in panic crashing into their western cousins, the Tervings, ruled by a man named Athanaric. For a time, Athanaric tried to hold his ground. He ordered defensive ditches, dug raised barricades along the Dniester, and called up every fighting man. He believed with Gothic pride that no wandering nomads could force him from his ancestral lands. But the Huns didn't come like an army. They came like a sickness. They bypassed his defenses, moving through river valleys and mountain passes the Goths had thought impassable. They attacked at night, vanishing by dawn. Their arrows struck from impossible distances, their horses never tiring. No Gothic shield wall could form fast enough to meet them. When the survivors told their tales, they described the sky itself, darkened by arrows, and the air filled with a high, unending whistle, the sound of death arriving faster than sound should travel. By the time Athanaric realized what was happening, the Huns were already behind him. The defensive line he had built, the famous Athanaric's wall, was useless. His army broke apart, some fleeing into the Carpathians, others toward the Danube River, the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. And here, the story of the Huns became the story of Rome. Tens of thousands of Gothic refugees, men, women, children, farmers, warriors, suddenly appeared along the banks of the Danube, begging the Romans for asylum. Imagine the scene: entire families waiting on the river's edge, wagons full of what little they owned, oxen and horses half dead from exhaustion. The smoke of burning villages still rising in the east. Behind them, they whispered the Huns were coming. For the Roman governors stationed there, it was chaos. These were not small barbarian bands they could absorb or bribe. This was a nation on the move. Two, in fact, the Tervings and Greutungs, both pressing against the border, desperate to cross. The Romans had handled migrations before, but nothing like this. At first, Rome agreed to let them in. The Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople, saw opportunity. The Goths could be resettled as farmers in the Balkans, providing new taxpayers and soldiers. A humane policy on paper. In practice, it was a disaster. Roman officials along the Danube were corrupt. They took bribes to allow crossings, then extorted the refugees, selling them food at impossible prices. When the Goths ran out of gold, they traded their children into slavery for scraps of meat. Hunger turned to fury, and in the summer of 376 CE, that fury exploded. The Goths revolted. Valens, believing he could crush them easily, marched north with his legions. He met them at Adrianople in 378 CE, and there, in one of history's cruelest ironies, the refugees became Rome's destroyers. The Gothic cavalry shattered the Roman flanks. The legions burned in the heat. Emperor Valens himself was killed, his body never found. The Huns were nowhere near Adrianople. They didn't have to be. Their shadow was enough. It was their invasion that had set this catastrophe in motion. They had pressed the Goths into Rome's arms, and Rome, in arrogance and cruelty, had pulled the trigger itself. From that moment on, the world would never be the same. The Roman frontier, once a line on a map, became a floodgate burst open. Peoples began to move. Goths, Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians, all cascading westward, each wave pushed by the invisible force of the Huns behind them. And the Huns themselves, they were still coming. Still gathering power, absorbing what was left of the Alans and the broken Gothic bands that didn't make it across the river. They were learning from every encounter, learning about Roman wealth, Roman arrogance, Roman fear. In their endless camps under the steppe stars, the Huns must have known the truth that the richest lands lay not behind them, but ahead. Past the Danube, past the Rhine, past the great cities whose emperors still believed walls could stop the wind. The Huns were not yet a European empire, but the road to it had opened, and it was paved with ashes. By the late 370s, the Roman world was still pretending it was immortal. Yes, there had been plagues, border wars, mutinies, but Rome had always endured, always. To the senators in Constantinople and the generals along the Danube, barbarians were a nuisance, not an existential threat. You could fight them, bribe them, or hire them. Civilizations, they believed, did not simply end. And then came the rumors. They drifted in like smoke from the east, carried by frightened traders and hollow-eyed refugees. Strange horsemen were moving across the steppe, men with long skulls and faces carved by scars, riding beasts that seemed tireless, loosing arrows faster than Roman drills could count. They didn't farm. They didn't build. They didn't negotiate. They simply appeared, destroyed, and vanished. At first, Roman intelligence dismissed these stories as exaggerations. The East was full of colorful tribes and colorful lies. The Hunni, as some called them, were probably just another branch of Sarmatians, loud, unpleasant, but mortal. But then came the Gothic crisis and the rivers of refugees. The Danube frontier was no longer a border. It was a tide line. Governors sent reports thick with desperation, tens of thousands of Goths begging for passage, claiming that demons from the east had driven them from their homes. Demons. The word caught on. When the first groups of refugees were resettled in Roman territory, soldiers and farmers alike noticed the fear that clung to them. Hardened Gothic warriors flinched at shadows, whispering prayers to a god Rome had only half adopted. When questioned, they would mutter, "They ride like the wind." You don't see them coming. The ground shakes. The sky goes black. It was an eerie foreshadowing of how the Roman imagination would process the Huns, not as a political threat, but as a natural disaster. And then slowly, the facts began to take shape. Intelligence networks along the Black Sea reported destroyed Allan settlements. Roman traders returning from the Dniester found entire regions depopulated, camps burned, temples stripped bare. When scouts ventured north of the Danube, they found only smoke and bones. Still, the empire's reaction was slow. Bureaucracy dulled everything. Letters traveled months. Orders were debated. Senatorial committees convened. The empire was enormous, but its reflexes were arthritic. By the time the Roman administration truly believed in the Huns, the damage had already spread like fire through dry grass. To many Roman citizens, the Huns remained abstract, a rumor of apocalypse happening somewhere far away. But for the soldiers along the frontier, the signs were immediate. Patrols went missing. Smoke plumes rose on the horizon where villages had been. Caravans stopped arriving. And sometimes after dusk, when the wind was just right, you could hear the distant drumming of hooves. One Roman chronicler described the fear perfectly. The terror of the Huns outran the Huns themselves. Still, Rome clung to its habits. Emperors saw the chaos as opportunity. Barbarian refugees could be converted into farmers' soldiers or cannon fodder. The foederati system, the practice of settling tribes inside imperial borders in exchange for military service, was extended to the Goths. It looked brilliant on parchment. It looked less brilliant when those same Goths rebelled at Adrianople and annihilated an emperor's army. The empire began to sense that something was different about this particular wave of barbarians. The Huns were not just another tribe. They were a force multiplier, a shockwave that drove entire nations before them. Each time Rome crushed one threat, another appeared stronger and stranger than before. In Constantinople, bishops and poets started to frame it in theological terms. Maybe these Huns were God's punishment for human pride, a scourge sent to humble civilization. The phrase would stick, flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, long before it would be pinned to a single man named Attila. Meanwhile, on the frontier, Roman officers did their best to make sense of the chaos. Scouts tried to track the Huns, but the nomads seemed to melt into the land. The plains north of the Danube were so vast, so empty, that whole armies could vanish in them. When the Huns wanted to disappear, they did, leaving nothing but hoofprints and arrowheads behind. A few bold or reckless Romans tried diplomacy. Envoys rode north with gifts and translators hoping to establish contact. Most never returned. Those who did came back, shaken, unable to describe what they'd seen in coherent terms. They spoke of an alien world of tents, and wagons of men who worshipped no recognizable gods, who treated treaties like horse dung, who laughed at gold but treasured iron. They also brought back details that would fascinate and horrify Roman society for generations. The Huns practiced cranial deformation, they said, binding infants' heads so their skulls grew long and sloping. They scarred their faces deliberately so that their enemies would see death approaching even in daylight. They filed their teeth. They drank mare's milk fermented into sour, potent liquor. They carried no wagons of supplies because their herds followed them everywhere. Food on the hoof milk, on demand motion, eternal. The descriptions spread through the empire like a ghost story told around the hearth. Mothers frightened their children into obedience with the threat the Huns will come. But inside Rome's walls, daily life continued: chariot races, debates in marble halls, trade ships docking in Ostia. Empires rarely notice their own twilight while it's happening. The senators still wore togas and argued about taxes. The priests still sacrificed white bulls to Jupiter. The barbarians, after all, had been raiding for centuries. What was one more horde? The answer, of course, was that this was not one more horde. This was the prelude to a transformation no one could reverse, because while Rome squabbled and theorized, the Huns were learning. They had begun to encounter fragments of Roman civilization coins, tools, soldiers, and they were watching closely. They were studying the way the empire worked, the way its legions moved, the way its envoys negotiated. They were learning the language of empire itself and preparing to speak it in their own way. When they finally came in force, they would not come as mere raiders. They would come as conquerors, with organization hierarchy and strategy borrowed from the very empire they intended to plunder. For now, though, they remained ghosts on the horizon. Rome had heard the rumors. It simply didn't yet understand that they were true. The Danube River had always been Rome's great northern wall, broad, glittering, and in theory, uncrossable without permission. On the far side lay the barbarian world forest steppe and the endless jigsaw of tribal lands. To the Romans, stationed along its banks, that river was security civilization's moat. But in 376 CE, it became a floodgate. When the Goths arrived, they didn't come as raiders. They came as refugees. Tens of thousands of them, families, herds, wagons, whole nations on the move, crowded the northern shore, waving their hands and shouting across the water, begging to be let in. Behind them, the smoke of burning villages rose in the east, and beyond that smoke rode the Huns. To the Roman frontier, governors, this was unprecedented. Empires were used to invasions, not evacuations. These weren't warriors demanding battle. These were people pleading for asylum. At first, Emperor Valens in Constantinople saw a clever opportunity. If he allowed the Goths to cross, he could turn them into taxpayers, farmers, and soldiers. A practical bargain, humanitarian in appearance, but strategic at heart. The Goths would defend the frontier they once threatened. What could go wrong? Everything, of course. Roman bureaucracy was as efficient as an overloaded ox cart. The governors charged with the resettlement, Lupicinus and Maximus, names that would later live in infamy, saw the crisis as a personal fortune. The Goths had gold, silver jewelry, even slaves. The Romans had grain. They began to barter starvation for bribes. Contemporary sources describe the horror in chilling detail. Food shipments failed to arrive. Desperate Gothic parents sold their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. And the Huns were still pressing at their backs. What began as refuge turned into imprisonment. Camps along the Danube filled with starving people. Roman soldiers extorted, humiliated, and occasionally slaughtered those who tried to leave. The empire that prided itself on order was creating chaos in its own front yard. Then came the spark. In 377 CE Lupicinus invited Gothic leaders to a banquet at the town of Marcianople, hoping to negotiate, or depending on your cynicism, to neutralize them. At the feast, wine flowed freely, too freely. Roman guards quarreled with Gothic attendants. Someone drew a sword. The banquet became a bloodbath. The Gothic general Fritigern, somehow escaping the slaughter, fled the city, rallied his people, and declared war. The refugees revolted. What followed was less a battle than a continental breakdown. The Goths rampaged through Thrace, striking Roman supply lines and recruiting enslaved laborers as soldiers. Imperial forces rushed in piecemeal and were crushed in ambushes by men who a year earlier had been begging for bread. And through all of it, somewhere beyond the Danube, the Huns watched. They didn't need to attack. They had already done their work. The domino effect was perfect. One push on the Steppe had set off a chain reaction that now toppled emperors. Valens, believing he could restore Roman honor, marched north in 378 CE to meet the Goths near the city of Adrianople. The sun that day was merciless, the dust choking. Roman legions, armored and disciplined, advanced under a cloud of heat shimmer, only to find themselves surrounded. The Gothic cavalry, many of them former Roman auxiliaries, struck from both flanks. Arrows fell like locusts. Horses screamed. Shields splintered. By evening, the Roman army had ceased to exist. The emperor himself perished, burned alive, they said, in a farmhouse set aflame by the Goths. His body was never found. Some claimed the earth refused to yield it. The empire had lost an emperor and army, and its illusion of invincibility all in one afternoon. It was, as one historian put it, the day the ancient world ended, though it did not yet know it. In the aftermath, Gothic refugees spread across the Balkans like wildfire, some settling, some looting, most simply trying to survive. Roman towns burned, trade routes snapped. The empire, once the patient spider at the center of a vast web, had become the fly caught in its own silk. And the Huns. They were still invisible, like a storm gathering just below the horizon. But their shadow stretched over everything. In Constantinople, the Senate began to whisper about omens. Comets, eclipses, plagues, signs that the gods were displeased. Bishops spoke of divine punishment, the wrath of heaven manifested in the horsemen of the East. The term scourge of God first appeared in sermons long before it became a title for a man. Even the survivors of Adrianople could not describe their fear without mentioning the unseen force behind it. One Roman chronicler wrote, "The Goths fought us, but the Huns defeated us." By the 380s, the Danube frontier, once a line of fortresses and watchtowers, was porous, bleeding people in both directions. Rome had absorbed its enemies, but lost control of its own bloodstream. The Gothic refugee crisis had exposed a grim truth. Walls and borders mean little when the world itself begins to move. The empire's stability had depended on everyone else staying still. Now, with the Huns pushing from the east, stillness was no longer possible. The refugees who survived would carve new kingdoms from Rome's dying body. The Huns would soon arrive to carve the rest. In the east, far beyond the frontier, campfires dotted the night like stars fallen to earth. The Huns were gathering, learning, waiting, sharpening. The grass bent beneath their horses. The wind shifted westward. History's greatest storm was still on the way. By the early 400s, the nightmare had a face. The Huns were no longer rumors from the east or shadows behind fleeing tribes. They were here in the flesh, encamped on the plains of modern-day Hungary, where the Danube bends like a silver scythe through grasslands and low hills. For centuries, that region had been the heart of Roman frontier defense, a patchwork of forts, trade towns, and client kingdoms. Now, it was the heartland of the Huns. From this base, they would launch raids that reached the Alps, the Balkans, even deep into Gaul. But at this stage, they were not yet a unified empire. The Huns were still a confederation of tribes, nomads, warriors, refugees, and absorbed peoples held together by charisma, fear, and loot. They had no capital, no written language, no bureaucracy. What they had was momentum. Archaeologists call this the Carpathian phase of Hun history, the moment when the riders of the steppe became the rulers of Europe. They established sprawling tent cities in the Great Plains, their wagons forming temporary streets. Each chief's camp was a miniature world of yurts, herds, forges, and firelight. At night, the flickering glow of thousands of fires could be seen for miles, and travelers spoke of the eerie music that drifted across the plains, deep rhythmic drumming mixed with the cries of horses and the haunting notes of steppe flutes. The Huns did not farm, but they knew trade. Roman merchants came tentatively into their territories drawn by the promise of furs, amber, and slaves. They brought gold coins, glassware, and wine. They left lighter, poorer, and less certain of their own superiority. The Huns' taste for luxury was growing. They began to wear Roman jewelry, decorate saddles with silver, and feast from looted chalices. Civilization, it turned out, could travel on horseback. But for all their wealth, they remained true to the logic of the steppe. Their settlements were temporary, their alliances fragile. Leadership shifted as quickly as the wind. Yet slowly, through both conquest and cunning, a hierarchy began to form. The first great Hun leaders we know by name, Rugala, or Rua, and his brother Oktar, emerged during this period. Chroniclers describe them as both terrifying and pragmatic men, who could negotiate with emperors by day and order a raid on their provinces by night. They understood power in the Roman sense, tribute diplomacy and reputation, but expressed it in the language of fear. To the Romans, Rugala was an enigma. He would send envoys demanding gold one month and offer peace the next. His demands were simple: pay or burn. The Eastern Roman Empire stretched thin by wars in Persia, and internal feuds often chose to pay. And so for the first time, Rome began financing its own conquerors. Each year, wagon loads of gold crossed the Danube tribute, they called it. The Romans framed it as diplomacy, but everyone knew what it was: protection money. In return, the Huns agreed not to raid certain provinces, though they never promised not to raid other ones. The Huns used that gold well. They built a network of alliances among the Germanic tribes who had once feared them: the Goths, Gepids, and Rugians. Subjugated chiefs were kept loyal with gifts, horses, and the promise of shared spoils. Rugila understood a crucial truth of empire-building: terror was effective, but inclusion was efficient. Hun society by now was a layered mosaic. At its top were the pure-blood steppe clans, the old families who traced their ancestry back to the mysterious East. Below them were the vassal tribes, Germanic warriors who had been conquered but not destroyed, now serving as infantry or heavy cavalry in Hun armies. Below them still were the enslaved, the human cargo that made every Hun camp hum with activity: smiths, cooks, stable boys, hostages, and artisans taken from conquered lands. This was not chaos. It was order by instinct. Every man knew his place, every chief his debt to the Khan. The Huns ruled not through written laws, but through presence. The chief's tent was both throne room and courtroom, and justice was often decided in the time it took to draw a bowstring. Yet within that apparent savagery was a strange sense of meritocracy. Among the Huns, a man could rise by skill, loyalty, and bravery, regardless of birth. A peasant who fought fiercely enough might become a general. A conquered tribesman who proved his worth might earn a bride from his master's family. Even Roman deserters, if they survived long enough, could find themselves drinking fermented mare's milk beside their new comrades. And Rome, ever adaptable, was learning to live with them. Diplomatic envoys began visiting the Hun camps, traveling with translators, priests, and carefully wrapped chests of gold. They described a society both alien and familiar. One such envoy, Priscus of Panium, later wrote of his journey to a Hun camp. He saw chieftains dining on wooden benches, eating from bronze plates, their horses tethered just outside the tent. He noticed how they toasted with Roman wine one moment and sacrificed a horse to the steppe gods the next. There was no contradiction in this. The Huns saw the world as a marketplace of strength. What impressed him most was their discipline. Contrary to popular Roman belief, the Huns weren't chaotic marauders. Their camps were meticulously organized. Herds were rotated with mathematical precision to avoid overgrazing. Weapons were inspected daily. Even their tents were arranged by rank and allegiance. The Romans, who prided themselves on order, found it unsettling to see such structure without civilization's trappings. No marble, no temples, no cities. Just leather smoke and motion. By the 420s, the Huns were indispensable to European politics. They had become both sword and shield, hired by one empire to threaten another, by one tribe to annihilate its rival. When the Eastern Empire needed help quelling rebellious Goths, they paid the Huns. When the Western Empire needed mercenaries in Gaul, they hired the same. And always, the gold flowed north into the hands of men who measured wealth not in coins, but in horses and fear. From the ashes of a dozen migrations, the Huns had built something new, a mobile empire without borders, a civilization on horseback. The Volga was behind them, the Danube beneath their hooves, and Rome, tired, rich, distracted, was beginning to look less like a threat and more like an opportunity. In the windswept plains of the Carpathian Basin, where their tents shone like flickering embers under the setting sun, a new generation of Huns was growing up. Boys who had never seen Asia, who spoke words borrowed from Goths and Romans alike, who could string a bow before they could shave. And among those boys, one name would one day rise above all others, one that would make emperors stammer, priests pray, and poets tremble. Attila. By the time Attila was born, sometime near the dawn of the 5th century, the world had already learned to fear his people, but it had not yet learned to fear him. The Huns, under their kings Rugila and Oktar, ruled a loose federation that stretched from the steppes of the Black Sea to the plains of the Danube. They were feared, yes, but their power was diffuse, shared among dozens of chieftains who owed allegiance only as long as tribute and intimidation held. Attila entered this world not as an emperor, but as a prince in a tent, a child surrounded by horses, weapons, and the scent of smoke. The legends say he was born beneath a red sky, and that a drop of blood fell upon the ground the moment he first cried. Even if that's just poetic exaggeration, it fits the man history would come to know. He and his elder brother, Bleda, were raised as heirs to a growing empire without walls. Their education, such as it was, came not from scrolls, but from stories, war games, and the rhythm of hooves. They learned early that leadership meant balanced generosity to your warriors, cruelty to your enemies, and an unshakable will that made both respect you. By the time their uncle Rugila died around 434 CE, the brothers were ready to rule. The empire they inherited was powerful, but fragile, an uneasy alliance of tribes, Huns-Alans, Ostrogoths, Gepids, and countless others, each with its own ambitions. To keep them united required more than swords. It required fear, prophet, and myth. Attila and Bleda ruled jointly. at first an arrangement that must have made the gods laugh. Bleda, older and perhaps more cautious, favored diplomacy. Attila, younger and hungrier, believed in action. Together, though they proved devastatingly effective. Their first great act was not conquest, but negotiation. In 435 CE, the brothers met with envoys of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II at the city of Margus, modern Požarevac, Serbia. The Romans, weary of Hun raids and eager for peace, offered tribute. The resulting treaty of Margus was stunning. The empire would pay the Huns 700 pounds of gold each year to ensure friendship. The Huns smiled and agreed, of course. For them, tribute was not humiliation, it was strategy. Every coin they received was a weapon. They didn't have to forge a horse, they didn't have to breed. Rome was funding its own intimidation. The treaty didn't last long. It never did. Within a few years, Bleda and Attila accused the Romans of violating the agreement. Whether they had or not hardly mattered. In Hun diplomacy, guilt was less important than opportunity. The brothers crossed the Danube with their armies, moving like a tide through the Balkans. They took Nisus, modern Niš, Singidunum, Belgrade, and Viminacium, burning and looting as they went. Roman defenses collapsed in a matter of weeks. When Theodosius begged for peace again, the Huns dictated harsher terms. The tribute would double to what, 400 pounds of gold per year. The brothers returned to their camp, rich, victorious, and more united than ever. For a while. For all their shared power, the differences between Attila and Bleda deepened with each victory. Bleda was the elder and considered himself senior ruler, but Attila's charisma, dark calm, almost magnetic, was undeniable. He spoke softly, but when he entered a tent, men fell silent. He was said to be neither boastful nor cruel for sport, but utterly incapable of forgiveness. To his followers, Attila embodied the ideal of the steppe warlord, disciplined, cunning, and unsentimental. To his enemies, he seemed something less than human, a force of nature, a storm given flesh. Even Roman envoys who met him in person would later describe his presence with a kind of haunted awe, and yet for all that menace, he was methodical. He drank sparingly, ate simply, and ruled not by indulgence, but by efficiency. While his nobles feasted from golden plates, Attila, they said, used only a wooden cup. He understood that image was power, that even restraint could be a weapon. Sometime around 445 CE, Bleda died. Officially, it was said to be a hunting accident. Unofficially, everyone knew better. History doesn't record how it happened, only that Attila emerged from the incident as sole ruler of the Huns. Some say he shot his brother with an arrow during a boar hunt. Others that Bleda's loyalists were quietly executed in the following days. Whatever the truth, no one dared question it. From that moment, the age of Attila the Hun truly began. With his brother gone, Attila moved swiftly to consolidate power. He executed or exiled rival chieftains, restructured the army, and centralized control over diplomacy. The once loose federation of tribes became something more coherent, a war machine built around his authority. He also refined the empire's finances. Tribute from the Romans now flowed directly into his personal treasury. Blacksmiths and armorers worked around the clock. New herds were bred, new alliances forged. His messengers traveled across Europe, summoning every Hun and vassal to his banner. The transformation was astonishing. The steppe confederation that had once depended on raids was now capable of planning campaigns years in advance. Attila's scouts mapped routes through the Alps and the forests of Gaul. His diplomats learned to read Roman intentions better than Roman senators did, and yet the old Hun spirit remained. The empire still moved with its horses. Its palaces were still tents of dyed leather, its wealth still measured by weight of plunder and prestige. In Constantinople, the Emperor Theodosius sent envoys bearing gifts and flatteries. Among them was Priscus of Panium, the Greek historian, whose writings give us our most vivid glimpse of Attila's court. Priscus described a world that defied Roman understanding. Attila's camp was massive, laid out with the precision of a city streets of wagons. Quarters for ambassadors, forges hammering through the night. In the center stood the royal tent, a great hall of wooden beams hung with bright textiles and gold ornaments taken from Roman churches. When Priscus met Attila, he found not a beast, but a ruler of chilling composure. The king greeted him politely, listened through interpreters, and laughed at Roman flattery. His face said Priscus was stern, but calm, his eyes sharp and unblinking. At the banquet that followed, Attila sat on a plain wooden stool, while his nobles reclined on cushions of silk. He drank last and least. When a bard began singing songs of Hun victories, the entire court fell silent. Attila alone did not smile. He never did. By the time the envoys left, they understood the truth. This was no barbarian chief. This was a strategist, a ruler who understood the psychology of empire as well as any Roman. The world, though it didn't know it yet, was standing on the edge of his ambition. Under Attila, the Huns were no longer content to be the shadow behind other people's wars. They would soon step into the sunlight themselves, and the light, when it came, would burn. When Attila became sole ruler of the Huns, the earth itself seemed to take notice. Rivers froze. Late that winter, herds grew restless, and across the Roman frontiers, the air felt charged, as if the horizon was holding its breath. The tribes of the steppe had long been united only by convenience and fear, but now, for the first time, they were bound by the will of one man. No one challenged him. Those who might have simply vanished. His rivals understood what his followers already knew. Attila was not just another warlord. He was inevitability in human form. He wasted no time consolidating his empire. Within months of Bleda's death, Attila summoned chieftains and envoys from every corner of his realm. Huns Ostrogoths, Alans, Rugians Gepids, even renegade Romans. They gathered on the broad plains of Pannonia, where his royal encampment spread like a small city, hundreds of tents, herds, grazing on every horizon, smiths hammering through the night. When he emerged from his tent to address them, the air must have been thick with awe. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply announced that there would be no more rival kings, no more divided command. The Huns would ride under one banner, his, and any man who defied him would be trampled under his own horse's hooves. And somehow they obeyed. What made Attila terrifying wasn't madness or cruelty, but control. He rarely raised his voice, drank little, and demanded discipline from everyone around him. Where other chieftains flaunted gold and silk, Attila chose simplicity, a rough wool tunic, plain boots, a wooden drinking cup. His restraint was a message. He didn't need opulence to prove his power. He was power. The Roman historian Priscus, who visited his court, described him as short of stature with a broad chest, a large head, and small eyes. But it was his presence, not his appearance, that left the deepest mark. Priscus wrote that in Attila's company, laughter felt dangerous and silence heavier than stone. Yet this quiet, disciplined man ruled through both fear and generosity. He rewarded loyalty with gold horses and prestige. He distributed spoils among his warriors like a father feeding his sons. He kept a watchful eye on the clans rotating leadership positions to prevent any single tribe from becoming too powerful. The Hun Empire under Attila was a balancing act, one man's will, holding together dozens of volatile nations. And Rome was his greatest theater. Since the Treaty of Margus, the Eastern Roman Empire had paid the Huns enormous sums to maintain peace. Attila considered those payments not as bribes, but as rent compensation for allowing an empire to exist on what he viewed as his soil. When Theodosius II hesitated to pay, Attila sent envoys to remind him that peace was a luxury, not a right. In 441 CE, he decided to prove the point. While Theodosius's armies were distracted fighting the Vandals in Africa and the Persians in the east, Attila struck. His forces crossed the Danube like a swarm of locusts, raiding Viminacium Nisus and Singidunum cities that had already suffered once before. This time, there was no mercy. Walls that had stood since the days of Trajan crumbled under Hun siege engines. Survivors were enslaved or scattered. Churches and temples alike were looted for gold and marble. But Attila wasn't a senseless destroyer. He didn't slaughter everyone. He wanted witnesses. Refugees and envoys were allowed to flee to spread the word of his approach. The more terrified his enemies became, the less he needed to fight. When Theodosius finally sued for peace in 443 CE, the terms were staggering. The Romans would pay 2,000 pounds of gold per year, 3 times the previous amount, and hand over any Roman citizens who had fled to the Huns' protection. Attila's envoys returned home laden with treasure, and the king greeted them, not with jubilation, but with quiet satisfaction. For him, gold was not wealth, it was leverage. Every pound he took from Rome was a pound less they could use to resist him. His control extended to every corner of his world. Messengers on horseback carried his orders across Europe, ensuring his will was known from the Black Sea to the Rhine. His scouts mapped roads, rivers, and mountain passes, and his smiths worked tirelessly to supply arms. It's said that in his camp, no tool or weapon was left idle for long. Even horses were trained to obey without rein or spur. His army could move faster than any in Europe, and his court, that strange fusion of nomadic and imperial culture, became a magnet for diplomats and spies. Gothic princes sought his favor. Roman ambassadors brought gifts and flattery, and everyone who entered his tent left understanding that they had just met the most dangerous man alive. Attila's capital, if it could be called that, lay near the river Tisa, what Priscus described as a great wooden village. At its heart was his grand hall, constructed of polished timbers, decorated with gold and silver spoils from 100 campaigns. It was not elegant like a Roman palace, but it radiated authority. Here he received envoys, dispensed judgment, and planned conquests. At his side was a circle of advisors, men like Onegesius, his trusted minister, and Edico, a half-Roman noble who acted as both envoy and spy. Attila valued intelligence as much as strength. His diplomacy was as sharp as his arrows. He could flatter, threaten, or deceive with equal skill, and he often used the Romans' own bureaucracy against them. He began sending his own envoys to Constantinople, not to negotiate, but to inspect. They entered the imperial court with the confidence of equals, taking note of Roman defenses, wealth, and morale. Their reports told Attila everything he needed. The empire was rich, divided, and afraid. To his allies and vassals, Attila presented himself as a protector, a king ordained by fate. To the Romans, he was a specter. To the men who served under him, he was a god. They called him by titles that blended myth and power: the one above men, the whip of heaven, the man born to rule the world. In time, Attila began to believe it too. But his ambition wasn't merely to destroy Rome. He wanted to dominate it, to make emperors bow to him, not just pay him. And he had the patience of a man who understood that terror works best when it arrives slowly. While his empire grew fat on gold, Attila watched, waited, and planned. The Eastern Empire was bled nearly dry. The Western Empire, still reeling from civil wars and Gothic revolts, was next. But even Attila couldn't have guessed that his next great campaign would begin not with strategy, but with a letter from a Roman princess. Her name was Honoria, and her plea for help would soon invite the scourge of God to claim half of Europe as his wedding gift. When the snows melted in the spring of 441 CE, the Danube ran high and fast, and across its waters the world began to burn again. The Eastern Roman Empire had been foolish enough to test Attila's patience. A few fortresses along the frontier, thought to be untouchable, had taken advantage of temporary peace to stop paying tribute and to harass Hun envoys. One Roman commander even plundered a Hun burial mound, an act the steppe considered not just theft, but sacrilege. Attila waited, as he always did, until the insult had ripened into an excuse. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, he unleashed his army. What came next wasn't war, it was dissection. His forces moved in three waves. One swept through the province of Moesia, torching the cities of Viminacium and Singidunum. Another stormed Nisus, razing it so completely that centuries later its ruins were still haunted by local legend. The third advanced down the Morava Valley toward Serdica and Philippopolis, slicing through the Balkans like a hot knife through silk. The Huns had evolved beyond raiding. Under Attila's command, they brought siege engineers, infantry auxiliaries, and catapult skills borrowed from the very empires they now punished. Their archers covered the walls in waves of arrows, their engineers undermined fortifications, and their heavy cavalry trampled whatever survived. To the astonishment of Roman generals, the Huns had learned to besiege cities. What had once seemed impossible, the horse nomads mastering the art of taking stone walls, was now horrifyingly real. Behind them, the smoke rose day and night. Cities that had existed since the age of Augustus disappeared in a matter of days. The Eastern Empire's borderlands became a charred belt of silence. When Emperor Theodosius II heard the news in Constantinople, he ordered his ministers to sue for peace. But diplomacy with Attila was like negotiating with gravity. You didn't stop it, you only delayed the fall. In 443 CE, Attila's envoys arrived at the imperial court, led by his cunning minister, Onegesius. They brought a simple message: double the gold, or the Huns would visit Constantinople itself. The emperor paid. He had no choice. For the next few years, gold caravans crossed the Danube like clockwork tribute disguised as trade submission, disguised as diplomacy. The Romans sent their finest negotiators, men trained in rhetoric and law, to soften Attila's demands. The Huns sent back gifts, piles of skulls, burnt armor, and occasionally a Roman hostage missing an ear. And yet, for all his brutality, Attila's campaigns were remarkably calculated. He didn't seek to destroy the Eastern Empire, at least not yet. He wanted to bleed it. Tribute was more useful than conquest. Fear more profitable than occupation. In the summer of 447 CE, however, something changed. Whether provoked by a late payment border skirmish or simply boredom, Attila launched a new invasion, the largest the Balkans had ever seen. His army, swollen with vassal tribes, numbered perhaps 200,000 men. They crossed the Danube in multiple places, sweeping through Thrace and Illyricum like a tidal wave. One Roman officer described it as the day the earth vomited monsters. Even nature seemed to side with him. That same year, an earthquake devastated the region, shattering the defensive walls of Constantinople. For a moment, it looked as if fate itself had opened the city's gates to him. But Attila, ever pragmatic, didn't take the bait. Instead, he encircled the empire, burning its provinces to the ground, while Constantinople trembled behind its half-collapsed walls. At Marcianopolis, the Huns annihilated an imperial army under the general Arnagisclus. When the dust cleared, the Danube frontier no longer existed. Attila stood unchallenged from the Black Sea to the Adriatic. But here, at the height of his destruction, he revealed a paradox: he was not interested in holding land. Once his point was made and his tribute secured, he withdrew. His empire was motion itself, a moving fire that fed on fear. Priscus, the Greek envoy, who visited Attila's camp during this period, left behind an extraordinary account. He wrote of an empire that moved with terrifying efficiency. The Huns, he noted, were everywhere and nowhere. Their camps stretched for miles, each tent perfectly placed, each horse accounted for. They ate boiled meat and fermented milk, laughed around their fires, and could break camp in less than an hour. And at the center of it all, Attila's tent. Priscus described it as both magnificent and austere. The walls were hung with fine linens, embroidered not with pagan symbols, but geometric patterns of astonishing intricacy. There was gold, but not ostentatiously displayed. Even the king's cup was plain wood. His throne was simple carved oak. What awed the visitors was not luxury, but discipline. At the evening feast, musicians played flutes, and bards sang of past victories, but Attila rarely smiled. When a Roman envoy attempted a joke about the tribute, the laughter around the tent died instantly. The king's eyes narrowed, and the man's courage evaporated. Later, over wine, Attila told his guests that he considered himself not just a ruler, but the chosen instrument of fate, a man sent by the gods to remind empires of their mortality. The Romans scribbled that down nervously. Centuries later, monks would still be quoting it, half in awe, half in horror. By 448 CE, Attila's power over the East was absolute. Theodosius II, humiliated and drained of gold, was a puppet emperor in all but name. Tribute poured into Attila's camp in such quantity that his horses wore harnesses studded with Roman coins. And yet even at his zenith, he never lost focus. He knew that Constantinople, protected by walls and sea, could not be taken easily. But to the west lay a different empire, weaker, divided, and far richer in the one resource Attila valued most: glory. The Western Roman Empire was rotting from within. Its emperors were puppets of generals, its provinces plagued by rebellion, its armies dependent on mercenaries who respected only coin. It was ripe. And then from that crumbling world came a letter, silken perfumed, written by a desperate princess. Her name was Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III. Trapped in the golden cage of imperial politics, she sought escape in the most dangerous way imaginable. She wrote to Attila, and the letter that reached his tent bearing her ring would ignite the greatest invasion of his life. By the year 449 CE, the world already trembled at the mention of Attila's name. To the frightened citizens of Rome and Constantinople, he was more than a man. He was a cosmic punishment, the embodiment of divine wrath sent to scour the earth clean of decadence. The title came from their own mouths: Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. The irony, of course, is that Attila himself never claimed it. He didn't need to. He simply accepted what his enemies whispered in terror and let their fear do the rest. But if the East had already been bled dry, the West still glittered, a wounded empire rich with opportunity. Its court in Ravenna was a theater of corruption, generals plotting against ministers, ministers against bishops, all while barbarian mercenaries guarded the doors. The Western Emperor, Valentinian III, was weak, overshadowed by his formidable mother, Galla Placidia, and her brilliant but cynical general, Flavius Aetius, a man who, ironically, had once lived among the Huns as a hostage and knew their world better than any Roman alive. And then came the letter. It was written by Honoria, Valentinian's sister. She was young, proud, and clever enough to know she was doomed. Forced into a political marriage she despised, she smuggled a plea for rescue to Attila the Hun, enclosing her engagement ring as proof of sincerity. How exactly the message reached Attila's hands, no one knows. Some said it was carried by a eunuch, others by traders who thought it a love letter. But when the Hun king read the words, he smiled a rare cold smile that made even his attendants uneasy. In her desperate appeal, Honoria had promised him her hand in marriage. To her, it was a cry for help. To him, it was an invitation. Attila sent his reply to the Western court. He accepted Honoria's proposal and demanded half the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. Rome predictably panicked. Valentinian accused his sister of treason and locked her in a tower. But it was too late. Attila now had what he wanted, a legal pretext for conquest. When a man like Attila finds both insult and opportunity wrapped in the same envelope, history tends to bleed. He began to gather his forces on the Hungarian plain, the heart of his empire. Tens of thousands answered his call. Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, Heruli, Rugians, a patchwork of peoples united not by loyalty, but by the gravitational pull of Attila's charisma and wealth. Chroniclers said his army stretched across the horizon for days, wagons creaking banners, snapping in the wind, horses snorting clouds of steam into the dawn. In Constantinople, envoys watched with dread. The Eastern Empire, having paid its ransom in gold, prayed that Attila would turn his fury westward, and he did. In the spring of 451 CE, the scourge of God crossed the Rhine. Before him lay Gaul, a land of vineyards, Roman villas, and soft cities unprepared for apocalypse. Behind him trailed a storm of dust and fire. His path was methodical. First Metz, then Reims, then Trier. Each city taken or torched. He wasn't just raiding now. He was punishing. And yet amid the horror, there was genius. Attila didn't simply destroy. For destruction's sake, he moved with strategic precision. His army split and merged like a living organism, cutting Roman supply lines, capturing river crossings, surrounding entire towns before their governors even realized he was coming. His scouts were invisible, his timing perfect. The chronicler Hydatius wrote that the Huns advanced like a pestilence, leaving no seed in the ground. But Priscus, who had met Attila, might have understood better. This was not madness. It was orchestration. Every act of destruction was designed to send a message the age of Rome was over, and a new power now dictated the rhythm of the world. As the cities of Gaul burned, panic rippled through the Western court. Emperor Valentinian trembled behind his walls, his generals argued, and refugees poured into every fortified town. But one man remained steady, Aetius the general, who had once been Attila's companion. He understood his enemy too well to underestimate him. He knew Attila's strength lay not in his numbers, but in his momentum. The only way to stop him was to unite everyone who still hated him more than they hated Rome. And so, in one of the strangest alliances in ancient history, Aetius summoned Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, and Alans to join the Roman army. Men who had once fought under Hun command now marched against them. The battlefield would be Gaul's open plains, where the future of Europe would be decided not by emperors or senators, but by the thundering hooves of cavalry and the courage of men who refused to kneel. Meanwhile, Attila pressed onward. His scouts reached Orléans, where the citizens prayed day and night as the Hun army encircled the city. Bishop Anianus, desperate, rang the bells until his hands bled, calling for divine intervention. And then, as if the heavens had answered Aetius, and his coalition appeared on the horizon. The siege was broken. Attila withdrew, retreating eastward toward the wide plains of Chalons-sur-Marne, where his army could maneuver freely. There, in the summer of 451 CE, he turned to face his pursuers. The Huns had never lost a major battle on European soil. The world held its breath. The night before the confrontation, Attila performed an ancient ritual. He withdrew alone to his tent, lit a sacred fire, and poured milk and blood onto the earth. Witnesses claimed they heard him speaking softly to the spirits of his ancestors, to the endless line of riders, who had crossed the steppe before him. When he emerged, the wind had shifted. The next day would bring one of the bloodiest clashes of the ancient world, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. But as dawn broke over the fields of Gaul, Attila didn't look anxious. He sat astride his black horse, calm as ever, his fur cloak rippling in the morning wind. Around him, tens of thousands of warriors waited in silence. He raised his sword, an old weathered blade said to be the sword of Mars, a divine weapon unearthed by his shepherds years before. Whether it was a myth or not, the symbol mattered more than the metal. Today, he said quietly, the earth will shake. And it did. History rarely turns on one woman's letter. But then few women ever wrote to Attila the Hun. The story of Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III, sits somewhere between tragedy romance and political farce, one of those small human sparks that managed to ignite an inferno. To most of Rome, she was little more than a scandal waiting to happen. To Attila, she became a justification for war. Honoria had never been the quiet, obedient kind of imperial princess. She'd grown up in the golden cage of Ravenna's court, where the air smelled of incense and intrigue. Her brother, Emperor Valentinian, was weak and easily manipulated by his mother, Galla Placidia, who effectively ruled the empire in his name. Honoria hated it. The gossip, the endless ceremonies, the realization that her every smile was a diplomatic transaction. When she fell in love with her chamberlain, a certain Eugenius, the affair was brief and disastrous. Once discovered, Valentinian had her lover executed and confined his sister under house arrest. Then, in a gesture of imperial cruelty, disguised as morality, he arranged to marry her off to a dull elderly senator named Herculanus, a man whose greatest achievement was living long enough to bore generations of courtiers. For Honoria, it was the final humiliation. Somewhere between fury and desperation, she came up with a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. If her own family would not defend her freedom, she would find someone who would. Someone powerful enough to make the emperor tremble. And so she wrote to Attila. The letter, likely smuggled out by trusted servants, was couched in polite Latin and imperial decorum, but its meaning was clear. She offered herself, her hand, her title, her imperial blood, to the king of the Huns in exchange for rescue. Enclosed with the parchment was her ring, the universal symbol of betrothal. Attila, when the message reached him, was camped somewhere along the river Tisa, fresh from victories in the east. When his interpreter read the letter aloud, the tent fell silent. Then Attila's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He saw the possibilities instantly. To a man like Attila, this wasn't romance, it was opportunity. If a Roman princess offered herself in marriage, then by the laws of diplomacy, her dowry was part of the deal. And who owned her dowry? The Western Roman Empire. Attila sent his reply formal and chillingly direct. He accepted Honoria's proposal and demanded half the Western Empire as her dowry. In Ravenna, when Emperor Valentinian received this letter, he turned pale. His court erupted in horror. The idea that a barbarian would claim an imperial princess, worse claim an imperial inheritance, was unthinkable. Honoria was immediately accused of treason. Her defense, that she only wanted to escape an unwanted marriage, fell on deaf ears. Her brother confined her in disgrace, but the damage was irreversible. The letter had done its work. Attila now had a legal pretext for invasion. He didn't need to justify war as greed or revenge. No, he would march as a suitor, come to claim what was rightfully his. To the superstitious and the devout, it was almost poetic, the scourge of God entering the heart of the empire under the banner of marriage. He sent word to Valentinian, "I am your brother. By alliance, your equal by rank, and I come to collect what is mine." The emperor's response, predictably, was to panic. He appealed to Flavius Aetius, his only competent general for protection. Aetius, pragmatic as ever, knew that Rome was no match for the Huns alone. He began forging alliances with tribes who had once been Rome's enemies: the Visigoths, under Theodoric Thurus, the Franks, the Burgundians. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Barbarians now stood as the last defense against the king of barbarians. Meanwhile, Attila was already gathering his horde. His camps on the Hungarian plain filled with warriors from every corner of his empire: Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, Rugians, Heruli, tens of thousands of men, drawn not only by gold, but by the legend of their leader. They came with banners painted in red and black, with skulls tied to their saddles, with the names of saints and kings carved into their arrows. To Attila, this was destiny. His priests read omens in the firelight. His shamans chanted to Tengri, the eternal sky god, asking for favor. They sacrificed horses, sprinkling their blood onto the earth, and declared that the gods smiled upon this campaign. When the army finally moved, it was like the shifting of the earth's crust. Chroniclers describe the sound of their approach as a storm of thunder without rain. Villages emptied at the rumor of their coming. Rivers were said to run red with dust. In Gaul, Roman officials wrote increasingly frantic letters to Ravenna. "The Huns are coming," one report read. "They move as though the world belongs to them." And in a sense, it did. By spring of 451 CE, Attila's forces had crossed the Rhine, flooding into Gaul. Entire cities fell before him: Metz, Reims, Trier, Auxerre, each one either burned or forced into submission. He spared those who surrendered, but made examples of those who resisted. At Metz, after the gates held for a single day, the Huns broke through and sacked the city. They set the cathedral aflame, its bells melting in the heat, while refugees poured westward toward Paris. The roads were lined with the dead. In his tent that night, Attila sat before a map drawn on animal hide marked with rivers and cities. His advisors urged him to continue south to take Arles and the Rhone Valley, but Attila's eyes fixed elsewhere on Orléans, the key to the Loire, and beyond it the road to Paris itself. For centuries, Rome had claimed to be eternal. Now, as Attila's army advanced, the eternal city's western shadow began to flicker. And at the heart of this apocalyptic march lay a single letter, a ring from a desperate woman who wanted freedom and who instead invited doom. In the spring of 400 CE, Europe began to tremble. The sky over the Rhine was dark with smoke, and in that smoke moved a sea of men, horses, and wagons, a tide of nations united under a single will. The Huns had come. For centuries, the Rhine had marked the edge of the known world. Beyond it lay forests, tribes, and the half-mythic lands the Romans called Barbaricum. But this time, it was not barbarians raiding the frontier. It was an army vast and organized, led by a man who intended not to plunder, but to claim. Attila crossed the river near Mainz, and the land seemed to recoil. The Roman garrisons, thin and demoralized, melted away. Those who stood were swallowed whole. To the towns that surrendered, Attila offered mercy. To those that resisted, he offered memory, because no one ever forgot what happened after. At Metzing, resistance lasted only a day. The gates were breached, the city sacked. Chroniclers wrote that the cathedral bells melted in the flames, and the streets ran with molten lead and wine. Survivors who fled west said that the smoke of Metz turned the sunset red for 3 days. Then Trier fell. Then Reims. The Huns moved with terrifying speed. Their composite bows bent and snapped with the same deadly rhythm that had destroyed armies on the Danube a decade earlier. The sound of their hooves rolled across the plains like thunder. But this was no simple horde. Attila's empire was a machine. His officers, Ostrogoths under Valamir, Gepids under Ardaric, Alans, Rugians, Heruli, all moved in precise coordination. Scouts rode ahead, mapping Roman roads and rivers. Supply wagons followed, carrying dried meat, fermented milk, and the treasure of 100 conquered cities. His camp stretched for miles, tents, forges, priests, and families. It wasn't just an army. It was civilization on horseback. Each night, when the fires rose across the plains, people whispered that the stars had fallen to earth. Attila himself rode always at the center, silent and watchful. His horse was black, its harness decorated with coins from Constantinople. Around his neck hung a talisman carved with the image of the palm sword of Mars, the mythical weapon his people believed had been given to him by the gods. He didn't laugh. He didn't boast. He simply advanced. His destination? Orléans. That city, perched along the Loire, was the key to Gaul. If it fell, the road to Paris, and from Paris to the heart of the Western Empire, would lie open. As Attila's army swept south, Gaul fell into panic. Roman governors fled. The roads filled with refugees. Whole towns emptied overnight, their people hiding in forests or fleeing toward the walled cities of the West. Bishops led processions through the streets, carrying relics and chanting prayers against the horsemen of hell. In Paris, a young woman named Genevieve. Later, Saint Genevieve gathered the terrified townsfolk and refused to let them abandon the city. "God will protect us," she said, and somehow, miraculously, he did. Attila turned west, toward Orléans instead. There, the city's bishop, Anianus, rallied the citizens and sent desperate messages to the Roman general, Flavius Aetius, for help. Aetius, cunning patient, and the last man in Rome who truly understood Attila, was already on the move. He knew the Huns could not be stopped by legions alone. The Western Empire's army was a ghost of its former self, thin, underpaid, filled with mercenaries. But Aetius had something Rome had always struggled to use: diplomacy. He sent envoys to the Visigoths, Rome's old enemies, now living in southern Gaul under their king, Theodoric the Mer. To the Franks, Burgundians, and Alans, he sent promises of gold and vengeance. He reminded them of what the Huns had done to the east, and what they would do to Gaul if left unchecked. And against all odds, it worked. For the first time in generations, enemies who had once fought Rome now fought for it. The Visigoths marched north, their warriors singing songs of death. The Franks crossed the Seine, their spears flashing in the sun. Even the Alans, who had once ridden beside the Huns, now joined Aetius, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of hatred. While these forces gathered, Orléans braced for annihilation. Attila's vanguard appeared, first dark silhouettes cresting the hills, their banners fluttering in the wind. Behind them came the siege engines, massive wooden towers, ropes creaking, wheels grinding through the mud. The city's defenders could hear them miles away, like the groaning of the earth itself. For days, Orléans burned. The Huns breached the outer walls and stormed the lower city. The bishop led prayers amid falling stones. Refugees crowded the cathedral, clutching crosses and each other. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and then when it seemed all was lost, salvation appeared on the horizon. Aetius had arrived. His allied army was vast: Romans, Visigoths, Franks, and Alans marching together under the imperial standard. The dust of their approach turned the sky gray. When the Huns saw the banners, Attila ordered a withdrawal. He was not reckless. He had no interest in being trapped within city walls. He wanted open ground where horses could run and arrows could fly. He retreated eastward across the fields of Chalons-sur-Marne, drawing the enemy into the vast rolling plains where he could fight on his own terms. The coalition followed cautious but resolute. Both sides knew what was coming. The Romans called it fate. The Huns called it inevitability. In June of 451, on the broad plain near the Marne River, two worlds faced each other, one ancient weary and dying, the other raw, fast, and merciless. Between them lay not just land, but the future of Europe. That night, as the camps prepared for battle, both armies could see each other's fires flickering in the darkness, tens of thousands of them stretching to the horizon. The wind carried the scent of smoke sweat and anticipation. Attila, sitting in his tent, ordered his priests to divine the outcome. They threw twigs and bone fragments into the flames, reading the cracks and smoke. When they finished, their faces were pale. The Huns, they said, will lose one great man, and the enemy will lose many. Attila's expression didn't change. He merely nodded and said, "Then tomorrow, the world will remember my name." Outside, the wind shifted. Horses stamped and snorted. The sky was moonless. The next day would bring one of the last great battles of the ancient world, a day of dust, death, and destiny, when the earth itself seemed to decide between the old order of Rome and the new order of the steppe. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was about to begin. The dawn of June 20th, 451, CE broke cold and gray over the plains near Chalons. Mist clung to the grass, and through it came the sound of horses stamping armor rattling, and the murmured prayers of tens of thousands of men about to gamble their lives for the world's future. Two armies faced each other across a vast open expanse. On one side, Attila the Hun, the scourge of empires, commanded what chroniclers later called a sea of nations, Huns at the core, flanked by Ostrogoths under Valimir Gepids, under Ardaric Alans, Rugians, and countless others bound to his banner by fear or fortune. Their camp spread across the plain in a wide crescent, banners snapping in the rising wind. On the other side, Flavius Aetius, the last great general of the Western Roman Empire, stood at the head of an army so unlikely it bordered on miraculous. Romans in battered armor. Visigoths, under their aging king, Theodoric III, Franks, Burgundians, and other tribes who had been enemies only months before, all now fighting side by side under the thin thread of necessity. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath. Attila rode before his men mounted on his black horse, his fur cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. He said little. Words were for lesser leaders. Instead, he carried with him a talisman, a sword said to have been found by one of his herdsmen, a blade he claimed was the sword of Mars, proof that he ruled by divine mandate. He raised it toward the dawn, and his army roared in answer, a sound that rolled across the plain like thunder. Aetius, in contrast, moved through his ranks, quietly speaking to his officers, tightening lines, positioning troops. He was no romantic hero. He was pragmatic, even cold. He'd spent part of his youth as a hostage in the court of Attila's predecessors and knew exactly what kind of enemy he faced. The Huns' greatest strength was their mobility, their ability to break formation, feign retreat, and strike from the flanks. Aetius's strategy was to deny them that freedom. He placed his forces on the high ground, securing the ridge that dominated the battlefield. The Visigoths held the right wing, the Romans and Franks the center, and the Alans, unreliable but necessary, guarded the left. As the sun burned away, the mist, Attila studied the ridge and understood what it meant. Whoever held that slope would command the field. He signaled his warriors to prepare. The air went still. Then came the sound, a low rolling growl that built into a deafening roar as the Hun cavalry began to move. Imagine it, thousands of horses pounding the earth in unison, arrows whistling ahead of them, the ground trembling as if the sky itself were falling. Their advance was not chaotic, it was precise, deadly rehearsed. The first wave of arrows struck the Roman front line like a storm of iron rain. Shields shuddered. Men screamed, horses reared. Then the Huns wheeled away, reforming for another pass. Aetius didn't flinch. He'd expected this. He ordered his archers to hold until the enemy came within range, then fire in dense, disciplined volleys. The air filled with the hiss of fletching and the smell of burning grass. For hours, the two sides exchanged death at a distance. When the Huns' cavalry finally charged uphill, the clash was like the meeting of continents. The Visigoths met them with a roar. Spears leveled, the cry of for Theodoric echoing across the field. The shock of impact threw men and horses alike into the air. The sound of it, metal bone and rage, could be heard miles away. In the chaos, King Theodoric was thrown from his horse, trampled beneath the feet of his own men. Some said he was killed by an arrow, others that a Hun spear pierced his heart. Either way, the news rippled through the Visigothic ranks like lightning. For a moment, they faltered. Then his son Thorismund lifted his father's banner and screamed for vengeance. The Goths surged forward with renewed fury, hacking their way through Hun lines. Attila, watching from the center of the battlefield, remained expressionless. He ordered his reserves into motion, his elite cavalry plunging toward the Alans on the Roman left. For a while, the outcome hung in balance, whole units disappearing into clouds of dust and screams. Aetius maneuvered his own cavalry to counter, while Thorismund, in a daring move, swung the Visigothic flank down the slope to strike the Huns from above. The two lines collided like waves breaking against each other, each side pushing, screaming, dying. By sunset, the field was an ocean of corpses. The grass had turned red. The river nearby ran thick with blood. The air stank of iron and sweat and smoke. Attila pulled his surviving warriors back to their wagons, forming a defensive circle. He ordered the construction of a massive barricade of saddles and shields, a fortress of leather and wood. His priests lit fires and began chanting prayers to the sky god Tengri. Some said he intended to burn himself alive if defeat became certain. But Aetius did not press the attack. He knew the Huns were cornered, but he also knew that to assault them at night with exhausted men and fractious allies was suicide. So both armies held their ground, separated by a field of death. When morning came, the silence was staggering. The Visigoths found their king's body beneath a pile of the slain. They wept, buried him on the battlefield, and swore that his spirit would guard Gaul forever. Aetius rode among the wounded, calculating. He had done what no man before him had accomplished. He had stopped Attila the Hun. And yet he didn't finish him. Perhaps Aetius feared that if the Huns were destroyed, their former allies would turn against Rome again. Perhaps he simply didn't have the strength. Whatever the reason, he allowed Attila to withdraw eastward, battered but unbroken. For Attila, it was his first true defeat, but not a final one. In the ruins of his camp, surrounded by smoke and carrion birds, he stared westward toward Italy. His enemies might have driven him back, but they hadn't destroyed him. He had seen the weakness of Rome, their bickering generals, their desperate alliances, their hollow wealth. The thought that haunted him was not vengeance, but opportunity. If Gaul bleeds like this, he is said to have murmured, then Italy will fall with a whisper. The scourge of God turned his horse southward. The following spring, his banners would rise again, this time across the Alps, where the last remnants of the Roman world waited, praying that he would not come. He would come. The fields of Gaul were still heavy with the scent of blood when Attila turned his gaze southward. He had been stopped barely on the Catalonian plains, but stopped was not defeated. His army was bloodied, not broken. His will, if anything, was sharper than before. The Romans called it a victory. The Huns called it an interruption. Winter came bitter and long. Attila withdrew eastward, his wagons trailing across the scarred plains, his soldiers wounded but defiant. The campfires that had once lit the horizon of Gaul now burned on the Hungarian plain again. There, surrounded by the remnants of his vast army, Attila plotted his next move. He was angry, but not foolish. He understood that vengeance must be patient. Rome was divided. The Western Empire's power was an illusion painted on crumbling walls. The general Aetius, who had led the coalition against him, was Rome's only competent defender, and even he was distrusted by his own emperor. And then Providence, or mischief, handed Attila an excuse. Rome had not paid its full tribute. The gold shipments, promised by treaty, had arrived late, or not at all. To Attila, it was both insult and opportunity. In early 452 CE, he summoned his war council. The chiefs gathered in his great tent, Gepid Ostrogoth Hun and Alan, each one hardened by a lifetime of conquest. The fire in the center flickered over their faces as Attila spoke in his low, steady voice. "The Romans think I am finished," he said. "They call me defeated. Let them see how defeat marches." The murmurs turned into shouts of approval. The decision was made. The Huns would invade Italy. That spring, the war machine moved again, tens of thousands of riders' wagons and slaves streaming through the Alps. Chroniclers later said that the mountains themselves seemed to quake under their passage. The snows melted red with the blood of beasts sacrificed to Tengri, the eternal sky god. The northern gates of Italy, once thought impassable, opened like paper before him. His first target was Aquileia, a proud Roman city near the Adriatic coast. Its walls were strong, its citizens defiant. When Attila demanded their surrender, they sent back only silence. It was a mistake. He besieged the city, his engineers, yes, engineers building siege towers, battering rams and catapults with Roman precision. For weeks the defenders held. Then one morning, the Hun soldiers noticed a strange sight, a flock of storks rising from the city's walls, flying away to the south. Attila smiled. "The birds know," he said. "They leave before the fire." That night his men launched a final assault. Aquileia fell. Its walls were torn down stone by stone, its people slaughtered or enslaved, its very memory erased. Ancient writers claimed that the ruins were so complete that no one could later find the city's foundations. The survivors, who fled to the nearby lagoons of the Adriatic, would build huts on stilts and fishing villages over the marshes, settlements that over centuries would grow into Venice. Attila moved onward. Milan, Pavia, and the great cities of northern Italy followed, each in turn paying tribute or burning. Roman villas that had stood for generations were stripped bare, their mosaics crushed beneath horses' hooves. The plains of Lombardy became graveyards of marble and ash. And still, Attila advanced. In Rome, Emperor Valentinian III panicked. The Senate begged him to negotiate. The people of the Eternal City packed their possessions and fled south toward Naples or west toward the sea. Some turned to fasting and prayer, believing only divine intervention could save them. Even Aetius, once confident and cool, was powerless. His army had been shattered at Chalons, his alliances exhausted. He could do little more than delay the inevitable. Attila's reputation by now was half mortal, half myth. Refugees told tales of his coming, that he drank blood instead of wine, that his horses left no hoofprints, that the earth itself split where he rode. The poet Sidonius Apollinaris called him the terror of the world. By midsummer, Attila's army reached the Po River Valley, the richest part of Italy. The fields were heavy with grain, the granaries full. He allowed his men to feast, to rest, to gather loot. But disease began to whisper through the camp plague, or perhaps dysentery killing men, faster than the Romans ever could. the Italian heat thick and heavy, was an enemy of its own. And then something unexpected happened. A delegation from Rome requested an audience 3 men sent by the emperor to negotiate peace. Among them was Pope Leo III, the Bishop of Rome, himself dressed not in armor, but in white robes, carrying only a cross and courage. When the Roman envoys reached Attila's camp near the city of Mantua, they found him seated on a wooden throne, surrounded by his generals and banners. They approached, without guards, without tribute, just faith. What passed between Attila and the Pope was never fully recorded. Ancient writers, perhaps out of reverence, left it shrouded in mystery. Some said Leo spoke so eloquently that even the scourge of God was moved to mercy. Others claimed Attila saw a vision behind the pontiff stood the shadowy figures of Saints Peter and Paul swords drawn, warning him to turn back. Whatever the truth, the impossible happened. Attila agreed to withdraw. The negotiations were brief. He promised to spare Rome if the empire resumed its payments and sent an imperial princess, Honoria, again as part of a symbolic peace offering. Then, without further bloodshed, he turned his army north and began the long retreat out of Italy. Rome was saved not by armies or emperors, but by a man in robes who carried no weapon but faith. For the Romans, it was a miracle. For Attila, it was calculation. His army was sick, his supplies low, and Eastern Roman forces were threatening his rear. Perhaps he had simply realized that burning Rome would win him little but ashes. Whatever his motives, the result was the same: the eternal city had been spared, and Europe exhaled in disbelief. Attila returned to his great camp in Pannonia, the plains of modern Hungary, laden with treasure and prisoners. He was still the scourge of God, undefeated, unbroken, and feared from the Black Sea to the Atlantic. But though his empire still stood, something had changed. His body was growing weary. His people were restless. And the gods who had once smiled upon him were beginning perhaps to turn away. The storm that had shaken the world was nearly spent. The man who had made emperors tremble would soon face the one foe no warrior could conquer: his own mortality. In the spring of 453 CE, the world's most feared man was alive and triumphant, but strangely quiet. The fires of war had dimmed for the first time in years. His vast army rested on the Hungarian plain, his wagons heavy with plunder, his tents hung with Roman silks and Gothic spoils. He had burned cities, humbled emperors, and bent 2 Romes to his will. And yet, for the first time in memory, Attila seemed still. He was not old, perhaps in his 40s, but war and command had carved him like stone. His face, once fierce, had grown thin. His eyes, still sharp, carried the weight of too many victories. Those close to him noticed the change. He laughed less, drank less, spoke less. Even his black horse, they said, walked more slowly beside him. Some believed he was preparing for another invasion, perhaps into Constantinople. Others whispered that he was tired, that he had conquered everything worth conquering, and now sought something else. That something arrived in the form of a woman. Her name was Ildiko. A young Gothic or Germanic noblewoman, Ildiko was said to be beautiful beyond words. Her hair pale as flax, her voice soft as river water. She was offered to Attila as part of a political alliance, one of the many brides who passed through his court in exchange for peace or tribute. But something about her caught his attention. When he announced that he would marry her, the camp erupted in celebration. The king's wedding was not just a personal event. It was a spectacle, a sign of prosperity and divine favor. The ceremony took place in early spring. The plains of Pannonia were greening, the air heavy with the smell of thawed earth and smoke. Warriors from every tribe gathered to feast. Oxen were slaughtered mead, and wine flowed in rivers. and the sky above the tents glowed orange with firelight. Attila, for once, allowed himself indulgence. He feasted, he drank. He laughed, a rare sound that startled even his closest captains. Late in the night, he retired to his tent with his new bride, while the sounds of revelry echoed outside. No one knew it then, but the empire of the Huns would die with the dawn. When the sun rose, the king's tent was silent. At first, his guards thought he was sleeping off the wine, but as the hours passed, unease spread. Finally, Onagesius, his trusted minister, ordered the tent open. Inside, they found Ildiko weeping. Attila lay beside her motionless, his face strangely peaceful. Blood stained his pillow. There were no wounds, no struggle. The great king, the scourge of God, the terror of empires, was dead. The cause remains a mystery. Ancient writers offered several versions, each colored by awe and fear. Some said he had burst a blood vessel in his nose, drowning in his own blood while he slept. Others claimed he was murdered, stabbed quietly by his new bride, on orders from enemies or gods. One later legend said Ildiko had been chosen by the heavens themselves to slay him, a mortal vessel of divine vengeance. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. The tent that had once held the voice of conquest now held only silence. When the news spread through the camp, warriors threw down their weapons and tore their hair in grief. Some refused to believe it. Others fell to their knees, crying out to Tengri, asking why the sky had taken their lord. That night, the Huns held the most extraordinary funeral the steppe had ever seen. They laid Attila's body in a silk shroud, his armor polished until it gleamed like firelight. His sword, the sword of Mars, was placed at his side. Horses were slaughtered in the thousands, their blood poured into the earth to carry their master's spirit into the afterlife. His men rode in circles around his tent, chanting his name, their voices echoing across the plains like thunder. Then, as tradition demanded, they wept openly, great warriors sobbing until their throats were raw. At dawn, they buried him, but not in a tomb, nor under a mound that enemies could find. The Huns believed that their king should rest where no man could disturb him. So they diverted a river, perhaps the Tisa, perhaps another, so that they could dig his grave in the riverbed. There, they placed him in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. The gold represented the tribute of Rome, the silver, the wealth of the East, and the iron, the weapon that had made him master of both. When the burial was done, they let the river flow again, erasing all trace of the tomb. The slaves who had dug it were executed so that no living soul could reveal its location. To this day, no one knows where Attila lies. After the funeral, the Hunnic Empire unraveled with astonishing speed. The unity Attila had forged through fear and charisma could not survive without him. His sons, Elakdengizich and Ernak, fought bitterly over succession. The tribes that had once ridden together turned on each other. 2 years later, at the Battle of Nidau, the subject peoples, the Gepids, Goths, and Rugians rose against the Huns. The confederation shattered. The surviving Huns scattered eastward back into the mists of the steppe. The empire that had once darkened Europe vanished almost overnight, and yet the legend did not vanish. In Rome, poets wrote that God himself had struck Attila down for his sins. In the East, storytellers said he had been taken alive into the heavens, his body transformed into a storm. Among the nomads of the steppe, they whispered that he still rode across the clouds at night, leading the souls of dead warriors into battle. He had come like lightning and left like thunder, sudden, absolute, unforgettable. For centuries, after the mere mention of his name made kings uneasy. When later conquerors rose, Charlemagne, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, each was called by fearful chroniclers a new Attila. His empire was dust, his tomb lost, his people scattered. but his myth endured. Because the truth was simple, you cannot bury a storm. You can only wait for it to return. When Attila's body sank beneath the river, so too did the unity of his empire. The torrent of the Tisa washed over his golden coffin, sealing more than a man's grave, it sealed an era. The storm that had reshaped Europe was over. The silence that followed was almost eerie. In the months after his death, the Huns tried to carry on. The empire he had built stretched from the Rhine to the Black Sea, its power drawn not from walls or cities, but from loyalty to Attila himself. Without that single will to bind them, the great confederation began to crack like ice under a thaw. Attila's sons, Elak Dengizich and Ernak, inherited his empire the way starving wolves inherit a carcass, fighting over the bones, before realizing they were poisoned. Elak the eldest tried to maintain order. He had fought beside his father in Gaul and Italy, and fancied himself heir to the legend. But Elak lacked Attila's gravity, his calm menace, his impossible charisma. His voice inspired obedience, not reverence. Meanwhile, his brothers plotted. Dengizich wanted to seize the Danubian lands and keep raiding the Eastern Empire. Ernak the youngest seemed to sense what none of them would admit, that the empire was dying, that the Huns' time had passed. Their vassals watched this chaos with growing satisfaction. The Ostrogoths, Gepids, and Rugians tribes who had once knelt before Attila began to whisper of rebellion. Why pay tribute to the sons of a dead man? Why bleed for a name when the name no longer frightened kings? By 454 CE, the tension snapped. The tribes gathered in Pannonia near the river Nidau, where the grass still bore the hoofprints of Attila's great armies. What happened there was one of those strange inversions. History delights and the conquerors became the conquered. The Battle of Nidau was less a battle than a reckoning. On one side stood Elak, and what remained of the Hunnic corps, still formidable, still deadly, but vastly outnumbered. On the other stood the coalition of former allies, now turned enemies, Ardaric and his Gepids, the Goths under Valamir, the Rugians, and countless others who had once trembled at Attila's shadow. The fight was vicious, personal, and final. Chroniclers wrote that the plains of Pannonia shook with the sound of iron on iron, the ghosts of 1,000 campaigns collapsing into one last frenzy of slaughter. Elak was cut down amid his bodyguards fighting to the end. When the dust cleared, the world had changed again. The Huns, those horsemen who had once been the terror of nations, were scattered. The remnants fled eastward, back toward the steppes that had birthed them. Some vanished into legend, absorbed by the Bulgars, Avars, and Magyars, who would later ride from those same plains. Others settled quietly among the peoples they once ruled, marrying into Gothic and Slavic tribes, their names fading into the soil. The empire that had shaken Europe lasted barely a lifetime, but the shock waves of its fall rolled on for centuries. The Gepids took over the lands of Pannonia. The Ostrogoths soon swept into Italy, founding a new kingdom on the ruins of Rome's own. The Western Roman Empire, already hollow, would stagger for just 2 more decades before collapsing entirely. And so, in a strange grim symmetry, both empires, the eternal Rome and the eternal Steppe, died almost side by side, victims of the same truth: nothing endures forever. But Attila's memory did. Even the tribes that had fought against him found themselves haunted by his legend. Among the Goths, mothers warned their children not to stray into the fog, lest Attila's riders take them. Among the Slavs, old songs told of a ghostly host galloping across the sky, led by a king with fire in his eyes. Centuries later, when the Magyars, a new wave of steppe nomads, rode into the Carpathian Basin, medieval chroniclers in Europe panicked. They called them the sons of Attila, convinced that the scourge of God had returned to finish what he began. The irony, of course, was that, in a way, he had. Every conqueror who rose after Charlemagne Genghis Khan Timur owed something knowingly or not to the path Attila had carved. His empire had lasted only decades, but his example was eternal unity, through speed fear, as strategy, mobility, as empire. Even his enemies couldn't forget him. In the monasteries of Western Europe, monks copied tales of his campaigns in the same trembling script they used to copy the Gospels. To them, Attila was both villain and instrument proof that God used terror to punish the arrogant. They painted him not as man or monster, but as both a mirror in which the sins of empires could see their reflection. In later centuries, poets would reimagine him as a tragic hero. In the Nibelungenlied, he appears as Etzel, a weary noble king who hosts doomed guests in his hall. In the saga of the Volsungs, he becomes a mythic figure tied to dragons and destiny. Every culture he touched reimagined him to suit its fears or dreams. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Attila was neither demon nor savior. He was the product of a world in motion, a world where empires cracked and nomads inherited the wind. He understood that civilization was not a wall of stone, but a pulse of will. When Rome forgot that he reminded them, brutally. The Huns vanished as suddenly as they came. Their graves are lost, their language forgotten, their gods nameless. But their shadow lingers on the map, in the memory of Europe, in the whispers that still ride the steppe winds. Somewhere, under a river, in the heart of Hungary, a golden coffin sleeps, holding the man who once made the world tremble. The current flows above it, calm and unknowing, as if history itself has chosen to keep his secret. But listen closely, on certain nights, when thunder rolls across the plains and you might still hear it, the faint echo of hooves, the cry of riders, and the distant voice of a king who refused to be forgotten. Centuries passed, and the wind carried away the dust of Attila's empire. The grass grew again over the plains of Pannonia, and the bones of warriors disappeared into the soil. Yet somehow, the world refused to forget. The Huns had come and gone, like a comet, brief, blinding, unforgettable, and their memory lingered in the skies long after their light had faded. For Rome, they became a kind of ghost story. The senators who had once cowered behind marble walls now spoke of Attila in hushed tones, as if naming him too loudly might summon him again. Priests called him Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, and preached that his invasions had been divine punishment for Rome's sins, greed, arrogance, decay. They told the faithful that Attila had not destroyed the empire. He had revealed it for what it truly was, a hollow shell glittering on the outside, rotting within. In that sense, Attila was Rome's last teacher, a brutal, uninvited one, but perhaps the only one it would listen to. In the East, Byzantine scholars wrote of him with the wary fascination one reserves for natural disasters. They admired his discipline, even as they feared his cruelty. Priscus, who had met him face to face, described him not as a monster, but as a paradox, a barbarian more self-controlled than any Roman noble, a conqueror who understood restraint better than peace. Among the steppe peoples, Attila became something closer to myth, a demigod of the plains, a spirit of the wind. The Turkic and Mongolic tribes who roamed those same horizons in later centuries claimed descent from his riders. To them, he wasn't gone. He had simply ridden ahead into the sky, leading an invisible host across the clouds. When thunder rolled over the steppes, they said it was Attila's army galloping through the heavens. Even his enemies' descendants couldn't escape his shadow. The Germans preserved him in their sagas. In the Nibelungenlied, He reappears as Etzel, a stern but noble king, tamed by civilization but haunted by his past. The Norse transformed him into a tragic legend, a warlord caught between fate and blood. For centuries, poets and chroniclers tried to decide what Attila truly was. Was he a destroyer or a purifier, a villain or a warning? The answer changed depending on who was telling the story. To the Christian chroniclers of medieval Europe, he was the hand of God scourging sinners. To the nomads of Asia, he was the proof that no empire could cage the wind. To historians, he was the hinge on which the ancient world turned into the medieval one. Because after the Huns came the vacuum. Their collapse reshaped the map of Europe. The Gothic kingdoms rose from their ashes. The Franks began their slow march toward empire. The remnants of the Hunnic Confederation, those who didn't vanish, drifted eastward, merging with other nomads to form the seeds of future powers, the Bulgars, the Avars, and centuries later, the Magyars, who would build the kingdom of Hungary on the same plains where Attila had once ruled. Every one of them carried echoes of the Huns' horse archery nomadic discipline, the belief that movement itself was power. The ghost of the steppe lived on in their armies, in their tactics, even in their myths. When the Magyars arrived in the 9th century, the frightened monks of Europe cried out that Attila had returned. They called the newcomers the children of the Huns, convinced that the scourge of God had risen from his river tomb to punish Christendom once more. The legend had outlived the man by 400 years. Even today you can feel it. Drive through the plains of Hungary, and you'll see it in the horizon, a perfect endless line of sky and earth, where the wind never stops moving. In villages, you'll find statues of Attila Kirali, King Attila, standing tall, his gaze fixed eastward, as if still listening for the thunder of distant hooves. Archaeologists have searched for his grave for centuries, digging along the rivers where the Huns once camped. They've found treasures, rings, Bridal's bronze cauldrons, but never the golden coffin. Some say it lies beneath the Tisa, some under the Danube, some far to the east, hidden by the gods themselves. But perhaps that's the point. Attila's true legacy isn't buried in the ground. It's scattered across the map of human memory. He taught the settled world what the nomads already knew, that no empire, no wall, no city is eternal. Everything that stands still eventually crumbles. Only movement endures. He was a reminder that history itself rides in cycles. Civilizations rise, grow soft, and are swept aside by those who still remember hunger. And yet, his story isn't just destruction. Beneath the ashes, something new always grows. Venice rose from the ruins of Aquileia. The Gothic kingdoms became the seeds of medieval Europe. Even the fear of the Huns drove the creation of alliances that would one day give birth to nations. It's tempting to think of Attila as an ending. But perhaps he was also a beginning, the violent heartbeat that pushed the world from the ancient age into a new one. And if you stand one quiet evening on the open plains where he once rode, you can almost feel it, the wind shifting through the grass, the rhythm of hooves far away fading but never gone. Because history remembers its storms, and the wind, as the Huns once said, never truly dies. Long after Attila's bones had vanished beneath the river, the wind over the steppe still whispered his name. It moved through the endless grasslands of Central Asia, the same wind that had once carried the smoke of Hunnic campfires and the thunder of hooves that shook the world. And in those winds, new peoples were rising. The Huns themselves were gone as a nation, but they had not disappeared. They had dissolved. Their blood, their language, their customs mingled with the tribes that came after them. The Bulgars, the Avars, the Onagurs, and the countless steppe peoples whose names flicker in the dim margins of Byzantine chronicles. The shape of their empire was gone, but the idea of it remained the dream of the open horizon, the faith that mobility was power. In a strange way, the Huns had left behind no ruins, but a blueprint. You can trace it, like a pattern across history. The same tactics, the same restless hunger, reappeared again and again. The Avars sweeping into Europe in the 6th century, the Magyars in the 9th, the Mongols in the 13th. Each wave came like an echo of that first storm, the sound fading, then swelling again. And always in the imagination of the settled peoples, they bore the same face. Every new horseman from the east was a Hun. Every galloping army that appeared out of the morning mist was Attila reborn. To the Byzantine chroniclers, it was almost comforting if you could name a fear you could contain it. They called the Bulgars Huns. They called the Avars Huns. They called the Magyars Huns. The word itself had ceased to mean a people. It meant a force of nature. And maybe that was fitting. Because if you strip away the names, the weapons, the languages, the story of the Huns is the story of the steppe itself, its eternal rhythm of expansion and collapse, its cycles of drought and abundance, its tribes coalescing under one banner and then scattering like leaves in the wind. The Huns were one movement in that symphony, one gust of history's breath. They came from the east, burned bright, and vanished back into the horizon that had birthed them. But their legacy flowed westward, deep into the bloodstream of Europe. The Bulgars would later build kingdoms on the Danube and in the Balkans, carrying traces of Hunnic horsemanship and political structure. The Avars would dominate Central Europe for 2 centuries, ruling from their ringed fortresses near the same plains where Attila's tent once stood. Their power would wane, but their influence endured in trade warfare and language. Then came the Magyars, led by their chieftain, Arpad, who crossed the Carpathians and settled in the very heart of the old Hunnic homeland. The medieval chroniclers who met them believed they were Attila's direct descendants, and the Magyars, sensing the prestige of that lineage, embraced it. They called their new realm the land of Hungaria, the land of the Huns. Even today, in Hungarian, the word for their country, Magyarország, still carries a whisper of that mythic inheritance. Statues of Attila Kirali, King Attila, stand proudly in Budapest, and Szeged, their bronze faces turned toward the east, where the wind still comes from. And the legend traveled farther still. In the west, the name Hun became shorthand for terror. Centuries later, during the First World War, Allied propaganda resurrected it as an insult for the German army, proof that even after a millennium and a half, the echo of Attila's horsemen still haunted Europe's imagination. But in the east, among the peoples of the steppe, the memory was different. They remembered not a monster, but a master of the plains. They sang songs of his courage, his iron will, his unyielding respect for the gods of the sky. To them, he was not destruction, he was balance. A reminder that the earth belongs as much to those who move as to those who build. It's easy, from the distance of centuries, to see the Huns as a storm that passed. But every storm reshapes the land it touches. They forced Rome to confront its own fragility, to adapt, to evolve. They set in motion migrations that redrew the human map of Europe. And in their wake they left a new world, one less Roman, more fluid, more alive. The poet Jordanes once wrote that the Huns burst from the womb of nations like a swarm of locusts. He meant it as an insult, but perhaps it was truer than he realized. Like locusts they devoured, but they also sowed change. The barren ground they left behind would one day bloom again in unexpected ways, because history never ends with silence. Somewhere, even now, in the winds that race across the Eurasian steppe, the story still stirs. The rhythm of hooves, the cry of eagles, the hiss of arrows through the grass. The world may have moved on, but the steppe remembers. And if you stand there long enough, just you, the wind and the horizon, you can almost hear it. The echo of a language no one speaks. The pulse of hooves, long stilled. The ghost of a man who conquered the world, not to own it, but to remind it that nothing lasts forever. Attila is gone. The Huns are gone. But the world they changed is still turning in their wake. Because history, like the wind, keeps returning to the same horizon. When the dust of the steppe finally settled, Europe looked nothing like the continent the Romans had known. The map that had once been carved in marble and law was now a living thing, fluid and unpredictable. The Huns had come and gone, but the world they left behind was forever altered, broken perhaps, but also reborn. In the ruins of empire, new peoples began to move, to mingle, to make something of their own. The Visigoths founded a kingdom in Spain. The Ostrogoths, once Attila's vassals, took Italy under their king Theodoric the Great. The Franks in the north began the slow work of building what would one day become France. The great Roman roads were still there, but now they carried the languages of a dozen tribes instead of Latin commands. Rome, once the center of the world, had become a memory, a crumbling relic haunted by monks and pilgrims. Its marble halls echoed with prayer instead of law. The Senate still met, but its decrees mattered to no one outside the city walls. The old world had fallen into twilight, and in that twilight, something new stirred the Middle Ages, an age that owed its very birth to the chaos the Huns had unleashed. For the first time in history, the West was free from empire and terrified by that freedom. The Huns had not invented the collapse of Rome, but they had accelerated it. Their invasions had cracked the outer shell of Roman civilization, and through those cracks poured everything the empire had tried to hold back: the migrations of entire peoples, the rise of barbarian kings, the blending of pagan and Christian worlds. The shock of their coming had shattered the illusion of permanence. It's almost poetic that the Huns themselves vanished so completely. They left no cities, no monuments, no scriptures, only echoes. They lived as the wind lives, invisible but impossible to forget. Even their memory adapted to the lands they'd passed through. In the Christian imagination, Attila became a symbol of divine wrath, a dark angel sent to chastise the prideful. Preachers in later centuries still invoked his name when warning kings about arrogance. Remember Attila, they would say, and how the Lord uses even the wild to humble the wise. But among the nomads, his legend took on a softer, almost sacred tone. In the tales sung by Turkic bards and Mongol shamans, he was not a destroyer, but a keeper of balance, the man who reminded the earth that it belonged to no one. In these songs, Attila's death was not an ending, but a passage he rode into the sky, joining Tengri, the eternal blue heaven. Between these two memories, demon and demigod, lies the truth of the Huns, a people who refused to be either civilized or forgotten. Their influence lived on, not only in myth, but in method. Every empire that rose after them borrowed a piece of their genius. The Byzantines studied their cavalry tactics. The Franks imitated their diplomacy of fear. Even the great conquerors of Asia, Genghis Khan, Tamerlane Babur, could trace their strategies consciously or not back to the Huns' principle of movement as power. The Huns had proved that empire did not require marble, nor bureaucracy, nor borders. All it needed was speed, loyalty, and vision. And once the settled world had learned that it would never forget. You can still see traces of their world in the quiet details of ours. The The stirrup they helped popularize reshaped medieval warfare. The curved bow, refined and perfected, became the weapon of empires from Hungary to China. Even the idea of the mounted warrior king, the rider who rules through charisma and fear, echoes through 1,000 legends, from Arthur to Genghis to every cinematic hero who charges into the wind. But the deeper legacy of the Huns is something quieter. They remind us that history is not a straight road. It's a series of migrations, collisions, and disappearances. Civilizations rise, fall, and leave behind not their monuments, but their influence. The Huns taught the world how fragile it was and how resilient. In their wake, Europe reinvented itself. From the wreckage of the Roman world emerged Christendom, feudalism, and eventually the modern nations that would dominate the next millennium. None of it was planned. All of it began in chaos, the same chaos the Huns had ridden through like wildfire. It's strange to think that a people who wrote nothing, built nothing, and left nothing behind could shape so much. But maybe that's the most Hunnic truth of all: permanence is an illusion. Power is not in what endures, but in what changes everything before it vanishes. When night falls over the steppe, the horizon still looks the same as it did 1,500 years ago. The grass waves in long golden ripples. The wind carries a rhythm older than any kingdom. And if you listen long enough, you can almost hear it, the ghost of hooves, the echo of laughter around a long-dead campfire, the murmur of a people who once believed that motion was freedom. The Huns are gone. Their empire is gone. But the world still moves in their shadow.